The day Eloise Marlin was sold to save her father's land, she wore a wedding dress that smelled of lavender and lies. Graham Calder, the man whose name made grown cowboys look away, waited at the altar with eyes like winter steel. Everyone whispered he'd broken men who crossed him, burned rivals' dreams to ash. Eloise trembled through vows she never chose, certain she'd married a monster. But that night, when he showed her mercy instead of chains, the first crack appeared in everything she'd been told to fear. Stay with me until the end of this story, and comment with your city so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The drought came to Colorado like a slow-burning curse, stealing moisture from the air until even prayers turned to dust on Sunday morning tongues. By the scorching summer of 1876, the Marlin Ranch had withered to something barely recognizable, cattle ribs showing through hide, creek beds cracked like old pottery, and hope as scarce as rain. Eloise Marlin stood at the kitchen window, watching her father stumble across the yard with that defeated shuffle she'd come to dread. John Marlin had once walked tall, shoulders squared against whatever trouble the frontier threw at him. Now he moved like a man carrying stones on his back, invisible weight pressing him closer to the earth with each passing week. "Papa's been to town again," her mother murmured from behind her, voice tight with the kind of worry that had carved new lines around her mouth. Eloise didn't turn from the window. She didn't need to see her mother's face to know the fear living there. She heard it in every word, felt it in the tense silence that had settled over their home like a wool blanket in August. Suffocating. Inescapable. "Did he say anything before he left?" "No. But I saw him take the last of the silver dollars from the tin. Eloise," her mother's voice cracked, "there's nothing left after that. Nothing." The words hung in the stifling air. Nothing left. No reserves, no hidden savings, no miracle waiting in some forgotten corner. The bank had been patient, patient the way a predator is patient, watching wounded prey struggle before moving in for the kill. Their patience had run out 3 months ago. Now they were just waiting for the paperwork to be filed, for the Marlin Ranch to be seized and sold to whoever would pay the back taxes and accumulated debt. Eloise pressed her forehead against the sun-warmed glass, watching heat shimmer across the parched land her grandfather had claimed 30 years ago. This earth held her childhood, every bruised knee from learning to ride, every summer evening watching thunderheads build over the mountains, every dawn helping her father mend fences while he told stories about the early days. Losing it felt like losing her own history, watching pages torn from a book and scattered to the wind. "There has to be something we can do," she whispered, though she'd stopped believing in solutions weeks ago. Her mother didn't answer. What was there to say? They'd already sold everything that could be sold. The good horses, the furniture from the parlor, even her grandmother's china service that had come all the way from Philadelphia in a padded trunk. Every sacrifice had been a drop of water on stones, evaporating before it could make any real difference. When her father finally came through the door an hour later, Eloise knew immediately that something had changed. His face held a strange expression, not quite relief, not quite dread, but something hovering between the two like a bird uncertain where to land. "John?" Her mother rose from her chair by the cold hearth. "What happened?" He pulled off his hat, turning it slowly in weathered hands. His eyes found Eloise, held her gaze for a long moment, and she felt something cold slide down her spine despite the heat. "I found a way to save the ranch," he said quietly. The words should have brought joy. Instead, the kitchen seemed to grow colder, as if winter had suddenly reached forward through the calendar to brush icy fingers against them all. "How?" Eloise heard herself ask, though part of her already knew she wouldn't like the answer. Her father's jaw worked, muscle jumping beneath sun-weathered skin. Graham Calder made an offer. The name landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of recognition and fear through Eloise's chest. Everyone in 3 counties knew Graham Calder. The man owned more land than most towns, ran cattle herds that stretched to the horizon, and commanded respect, or fear, depending on who you asked, from ranchers and businessmen alike. "What kind of offer?" Her mother's voice had gone very quiet. "He'll pay everything. Every cent we owe the bank, enough to stock the ranch again, rebuild what the drought took." Her father's knuckles were white where he gripped his hat. "He'll even pay extra so you can hire help. Make sure you're comfortable." "In exchange for what?" Eloise asked, though her heart already knew, was already racing ahead to the terrible answer. Her father finally looked away, couldn't hold her eyes anymore. "In exchange for Eloise becoming his wife." The words seemed to echo in the small kitchen, bouncing off walls and windows until they filled every available space. Eloise couldn't breathe, couldn't think beyond the roaring in her ears that sounded like distant thunder, like the world ending somewhere just out of sight. "No." Her mother's voice cut sharp as broken glass. "Absolutely not. We'll find another way." "There is no other way." Her father's composure cracked, anguish bleeding through. "Don't you think I've looked? Don't you think I've tried everything? The bank won't extend us anymore, won't give us until next season. They're foreclosing, Margaret. In 2 weeks, this place belongs to them, and we'll have nothing. Nothing." "So you'd sell our daughter?" Her mother was shaking now, fury and horror warring in her face. "You'd trade her like cattle to a man she doesn't know, doesn't love. You think I want this?" Her father's voice broke. "You think this doesn't kill me? But what choice do I have? At least this way you'll have a home. At least this way Eloise will be provided for, protected." Protected. Eloise finally found her voice, and it came out harder than she'd intended. "Papa, do you hear the stories about Graham Calder? They say he's destroyed men who crossed him, burned out rivals, ruined families. They say he's as cold as a Rocky Mountain winter and twice as merciless." "I know what they say," her father answered, and the defeat in his voice was somehow worse than his earlier desperation. "I also know he runs the most successful ranch in Colorado, that his men are loyal and well paid, that he's never been accused of any actual crime. Just rumors, Eloise. Just talk from men jealous of his success." "Then why does everyone fear him?" she shot back. "Because power makes people afraid, because success breeds envy, because—" He trailed off, rubbed a hand over his face. "Because sometimes a hard reputation is useful in rough country. It doesn't mean he's cruel. It doesn't mean he'd hurt you." "But it doesn't mean he wouldn't," her mother interjected coldly. Silence fell again, heavy and suffocating. Eloise looked between her parents, her father broken and desperate, her mother rigid with protective fury, and felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her shoulders like a physical thing. She'd seen Graham Calder only a handful of times, always from a distance. A tall figure on a dark horse, broad-shouldered and silent. The kind of man who commanded a room just by entering it, who made conversation stop and eyes drop when he passed. She'd never been close enough to see his face clearly, had only the impressions others painted with their whispered warnings. Hard as granite, cold as winter, merciless as a hanging judge. And now her father wanted her to marry him, to tie herself to this stranger for the rest of her life, based on nothing but desperation and debt. "How did this even come about?" she asked quietly. "Why would Graham Calder want to marry me? He could have any woman in the territory." Her father shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know all the particulars. I was at the bank, talking to Morrison about maybe getting just one more extension when Calder came in on business. Morrison mentioned our situation, not in detail, just that the ranch was about to be foreclosed. Calder—" He paused, choosing words carefully. "He said he was looking for a wife. Said he'd heard you were sensible and well-raised. He made the offer directly, right there in Morrison's office." The coldness of it struck Eloise like a slap. He'd heard she was sensible, not beautiful, not charming, not even particularly kind, just sensible, as if he were buying a proven workhorse instead of choosing a life partner. "And you agreed?" Her voice sounded hollow to her own ears. "Right there, without even asking me first?" "I told him I needed to discuss it with you," her father said quickly. "I didn't agree to anything yet. But Eloise, honey, we're out of time. The bank forecloses in 2 weeks. Calder said he'd need an answer by tomorrow." Tomorrow. The word seemed absurd, impossible. How could she decide her entire future by tomorrow? How could she choose between saving her family's legacy and surrendering herself to a man whose reputation made grown cowboys look away? "What if I say no?" She had to ask, had to know. Her father's shoulders sagged. "Then we lose everything. The ranch goes to the bank, probably gets sold to some land speculator from back east. Your mother and I, we'll figure something out." Find work in town, maybe, or head to California where her sister lives. Starting over with nothing. Her parents reduced to hired help in their old age after giving their lives to this land. The thought made Eloise's stomach turn. And if I say yes? Then we keep the ranch. The debt is paid, we get enough to restock, and your mother and I can live out our days on the land we built. He met her eyes again, and she saw tears gathering there. And you'd be the wife of the most powerful man in 3 counties. You'd never want for anything, Eloise. Whatever else Calder might be, he takes care of what's his. The phrase sent a chill through her. What's his? As if marriage would make her a possession, another asset in Graham Calder's extensive holdings. Her mother came to her then, took her hands in a fierce grip. You don't have to do this. We'll survive somehow. I won't have you sacrificed for property, for dirt and grass. It's not just dirt, Eloise interrupted softly. It's home. It's everything you and Papa built, everything Grandpa claimed and cleared and fought for. It's the only place I've ever known. She squeezed her mother's hands, felt them trembling. And if I don't do this, what happens to you both? You'd lose everything because of bad luck and drought, after all these years of hard work. Better that than losing you, her mother whispered fiercely. But Eloise saw the truth in her father's eyes, in the defeated slope of his shoulders. They wouldn't survive losing the ranch. Oh, they might physically endure, find work somewhere, scratch out some kind of existence, but it would break something essential in them. Her father would never recover from the shame of losing what his father built. Her mother would wither without the land she'd poured her life into cultivating. And Eloise would carry the guilt of knowing she could have prevented it, could have saved them with a single word. I need time to think, she said finally, pulling away from her mother's grip. Until tomorrow, you said? Her father nodded, looking ancient in the slanting afternoon light. Eloise walked out of the kitchen, through the house that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else, and out into the brutal sunshine. Her feet carried her without conscious direction, past the dying vegetable garden, past the barn where only 2 horses remained, out to the small cemetery on the rise where her grandparents lay beneath weathered stones. She sank down on the sun-hot earth beside her grandfather's grave, staring out at the land he'd claimed from wilderness. From here, she could see the boundaries of the ranch, modest by standards of men like Graham Calder, but infinite in the memories it held. That stand of cottonwoods was where she'd learned to fish. That rocky outcrop was where she'd gone to cry when her first love had married someone else. Every acre held a piece of her life, her history, her heart. What do I do, Grandpa? She whispered to the stone that bore his name. How do I choose? But the only answer was the hot wind, carrying the scent of dust and dying grass. She stayed there as the sun tracked across the sky, as shadows lengthened and the brutal heat finally began to ease. Her mind circled the problem from every angle, looking for some solution she'd missed, some third option that would save her family without sacrificing herself. But there was none. The truth was stark and simple. Marry Graham Calder or lose everything. As the sun touched the mountains, painting them gold and crimson, Eloise finally stood. Her body ached from sitting on the hard ground, but that pain was nothing compared to the weight in her chest as she walked back to the house where her parents waited. They looked up when she entered. Hope and fear mingled in their faces. I'll do it, Eloise said quietly. Tell Graham Calder I'll marry him. Her mother made a sound like something breaking. Her father closed his eyes, relief and guilt warring in his expression. Eloise, are you sure? You don't have to. Yes, I do. She kept her voice steady, refused to let them see how terrified she was. We all know I do, so let's not pretend there's really a choice here. The next morning, her father rode to town to deliver her answer. Eloise spent the day in a strange fog, moving through familiar tasks while her mind tried to grapple with the enormity of what she'd agreed to. She was going to marry Graham Calder, the man whose name made people nervous, the man whose reputation was built on ruthlessness and power, the man she'd seen only from a distance, never close enough to distinguish kindness from cruelty in his face. Her father returned with the news that Calder had accepted her agreement. The wedding would take place in 3 days, at the ranch. Calder would handle all the arrangements. All Eloise needed to do was appear. 3 days. 72 hours to prepare herself for a future she couldn't imagine, with a man she didn't know. The time passed in a blur of mechanical preparations. Her mother altered the wedding dress she'd worn 30 years ago, taking it in to fit Eloise's smaller frame, letting out the sleeves to accommodate the fashion of a new decade. The fabric was yellowed with age, and it smelled of the lavender her mother had packed it in, mixed with something else, something that might have been tears or regret, or both. On the morning of the wedding, Eloise stood in her bedroom, the same room where she'd slept since childhood, and stared at her reflection in the small mirror. The dress fit reasonably well after her mother's alterations, though it hung a bit loose in the bodice and the lace collar scratched her neck. Her dark hair was pinned up in the style deemed appropriate for brides, though wisps had already begun escaping in the heat. She looked pale, she thought, eyes too large in her face, lips pressed into a thin line. She looked like a woman being led to execution, not to the altar. "Oh, honey." Her mother appeared behind her in the mirror, eyes red from crying. "You're beautiful." "I'm terrified," Eloise corrected quietly. Her mother's hand settled on her shoulders, warm and solid. "I know. But Eloise, listen to me. You're stronger than you know. Whatever happens, whatever Calder turns out to be, you'll survive it. You're a Marlin, and we don't break." Eloise wasn't sure she believed that anymore, but she nodded anyway. The ceremony took place in the front parlor of their house, witnessed by her parents, the circuit preacher, and two men Eloise assumed worked for Calder, hard-faced cowboys who stood silently by the door like guards. Graham Calder himself arrived precisely at noon, as punctual as death. This was the closest Eloise had ever been to him, and the proximity made her breath catch. He was taller than she'd realized, well over 6 feet, with shoulders that seemed designed for carrying heavy burdens. His suit was fine but practical, clearly expensive but not flashy. His hair was dark, shot through with gray at the temples, and his face. Eloise had expected cruelty there, or coldness at least. What she found instead was harder to read, a face weathered by sun and wind, with lines carved deep around eyes that were neither warm nor cold, but something in between. Gray eyes, she realized, winter eyes, like the sky before a storm. He didn't smile when he saw her, didn't speak beyond a quiet greeting, just stood beside her as the preacher opened his book and began the familiar words that would bind them together for life. Eloise barely heard the ceremony. Her heart hammered so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. Her hands shook when Calder took one to slide a simple gold band onto her finger, a ring that fit surprisingly well, as if he'd somehow known her size despite never having been this close before. His hands were calloused, she noticed, work roughened and warm, not the soft hands of a man who let others do his labor. When the preacher finally pronounced them husband and wife, there was a moment of terrible silence. Calder looked down at her, and Eloise felt the weight of his gaze like something physical. Then he nodded once, to her or to himself, she couldn't tell, and turned to shake her father's hand. "The payment will be transferred this afternoon," Calder said quietly. "You'll have everything in order by week's end." Her father nodded, looking like he might be sick. "Thank you, Mr. Calder, and I hope you'll be good to her." Something flickered in Calder's winter eyes. "That's my intention." The words were simple but delivered with such finality that Eloise couldn't tell if she should feel reassured or more frightened. What did good to her mean to a man like Graham Calder? The same thing it meant to other men, or something entirely different? There was no wedding breakfast, no celebration. Calder had brought a wagon for Eloise's belongings, the few personal items her mother had hastily packed that morning. As the cowboys loaded the single trunk, Eloise stood in the yard she'd known all her life, trying to memorize everything one last time. Her mother held her fiercely, whispering promises that they'd visit, that this wasn't goodbye forever, that everything would be all right. But her voice broke on the last assurance, betraying her own doubts. Her father hugged her more gently, as if she might shatter. "If he hurts you," he said quietly in her ear, "you send word. I don't care what I owe him. You send word." Eloise nodded against his shoulder, not trusting her voice. Then Calder was there, offering his hand to help her into the wagon. His touch was firm, but not rough, and he made no comment when she couldn't quite meet his eyes. He settled beside her, took up the reins, and with a click of his tongue set the horses moving. Eloise looked back once, saw her parents standing in the yard growing smaller with distance, and forced herself to turn forward. That part of her life was over now. Whatever came next, she'd have to face it. The ride to Calder Ranch took the better part of 2 hours. Calder didn't speak beyond practical necessities, pointing out landmarks, warning her when the road got rough. Eloise was grateful for the silence at first, too overwhelmed to make conversation with the stranger who was now her husband. But as the miles passed and the silence stretched, she began to feel the weight of it. She snuck glances at Calder from the corner of her eye, trying to read something in his profile. His jaw was set, eyes fixed on the road ahead. His hands held the reins with easy competence, and he guided the horses around rough patches with the unconscious skill of someone who'd driven this route 1,000 times. He didn't look cruel, she thought. Didn't look particularly warm either, but there was something almost careful in how he handled the horses, how he'd helped her into the wagon, as if he was aware of his own size and strength and made efforts to be gentle despite them. Or maybe she was just desperate to find something reassuring in the man she'd bound herself to forever. When they finally crested a rise and the Calder Ranch spread out before them, Eloise couldn't suppress a small gasp. She'd known it was large. Everyone knew that. But knowing and seeing were different things. The ranch sprawled across a valley framed by mountains, with a main house that looked more like something you'd find in Denver than on a working cattle ranch. 2 stories of white-painted wood with a wide porch wrapped around 3 sides, barns and outbuildings arranged with military precision, corrals where horses moved like dark water, and in the distance, cattle dotting the landscape like scattered seed. It was beautiful and intimidating in equal measure. "It's very large," she managed. "It keeps me busy," Calder replied, and she thought she detected the faintest edge of something that might have been humor in his voice. They rolled into the yard and immediately ranch hands appeared, taking the horses, unloading her trunk, nodding respectfully to Calder while casting curious glances at Eloise. A woman emerged from the house, older and solid-looking, with steel-gray hair and a no-nonsense expression. "Mrs. Brennan," Calder said, climbing down and then turning to help Eloise. "This is my wife, Eloise. She'll need to be shown her room and made comfortable." Her room. Not their room. The words registered with a strange mix of relief and confusion. "Of course, Mr. Calder." Mrs. Brennan looked Eloise up and down with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing, then gave a small nod as if she'd passed some invisible test. "Welcome to Calder Ranch, Mrs. Calder. I'm the housekeeper. If you need anything, you just let me know." Mrs. Calder. Eloise felt dizzy hearing herself called that, as if the name belonged to someone else entirely. Calder turned to her then, and for the first time since they'd left her family's ranch, he looked directly at her. Really looked, like he was trying to read something in her face. "Mrs. Brennan will show you the house and get you settled," he said quietly. "I have work to see to, but I'll be in for supper. If you need anything before then—" He gestured vaguely toward the barn. "Someone will find me." Then he was gone, striding toward the barn with that same careful purposefulness, leaving Eloise standing in the yard of this massive ranch that was apparently now her home. "Come along, dear," Mrs. Brennan said, not unkindly. "Let's get you out of this heat." The house was even more impressive inside. High ceilings, polished wood floors, furniture that looked both expensive and comfortable. Mrs. Brennan led her up a broad staircase to the second floor, down a hallway lined with closed doors, and finally to a corner room flooded with afternoon light. "This is your room," the housekeeper announced, opening the door to reveal a space larger than Eloise's entire bedroom at home. A big bed with a carved headboard dominated one wall, covered in a quilt that looked hand-stitched. A wardrobe stood against another wall, and through an open door, Eloise could see what appeared to be a private bathing room. "My room," she repeated slowly. "Not Mr. Calder's room." Mrs. Brennan's expression softened slightly. "Mr. Calder's room is down the hall. He said you'd have your own space." She busied herself opening curtains, smoothing the already smooth quilt. "He's a good man, Mrs. Calder. Knows people say otherwise, but I've worked for him near 10 years, and I've never seen him be cruel. Demanding, yes. Expects things done right. But not cruel." Eloise sank onto the edge of the bed, suddenly exhausted. "Why did he marry me?" she asked quietly. "He could have anyone. Why, Why me? The housekeeper was quiet for a long moment. Then she came and sat beside Eloise with surprising familiarity. Can't say I know his full thinking, dear, but I can tell you this. Graham Calder is a man who does things for reasons, even if he doesn't always share those reasons. He's been alone a long time, built all this with his own hands and determination. Maybe he decided it was time to build something else. A family, perhaps. A family. With a woman he'd essentially purchased to save her father's ranch. The thought should have made Eloise angry, but she was too tired, too overwhelmed to muster anything beyond a weary resignation. He said he wouldn't touch me unless I asked, she said, more to herself than to Mrs. Brennan. The housekeeper nodded. Then he won't. If Graham Calder gives his word, he keeps it. You're safe here, Mrs. Calder. Whatever else you might fear, you're safe. It was small comfort, but it was something. Eloise clung to it as Mrs. Brennan left her to rest, as the shadows lengthened across her new room, as evening approached, and with it, her first supper as Graham Calder's wife. When the dinner bell rang, Eloise made her way downstairs on shaking legs, still wearing the yellowed wedding dress because she didn't know what else to put on. She found the dining room easily enough, a long table that could seat a dozen, though only 2 places were set, at opposite ends. Calder was already there, standing by the window with a glass of what looked like whiskey. He'd changed out of his suit into plain work clothes, denim pants and a simple cotton shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows. Somehow he looked more intimidating this way, more real. He turned when she entered, and again that careful look, as if he was trying to figure out what she was thinking. "You found it all right," he said. Yes, Mrs. Brennan was very helpful. An awkward silence fell. Calder gestured to the table. "Shall we sit?" The meal was surprisingly good. Roast beef, potatoes, vegetables that had clearly come from somewhere with more water than the drought had left in local gardens. They ate in near silence, the length of the table between them emphasizing the strange formality of the situation. Finally, when Eloise couldn't bear it anymore, she set down her fork and looked directly at him. "Why did you marry me, Mr. Calder?" He didn't seem surprised by the question, took a sip of his drink, considered her with those winter storm eyes. "Graham," he said. "You should call me Graham. We're married now." "All right. Graham, why did you marry me?" He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then, "Because I'm tired of being alone. Because this ranch is successful and profitable and means nothing if I've got no one to share it with. Because—" He paused, seemed to choose his words with unusual care. "Because I heard you were kind and sensible, and those are qualities I value more than beauty or charm." "You heard I was sensible," Eloise repeated, unable to keep the slight edge from her voice. "Like buying proven livestock." Something that might have been a smile flickered at the corner of his mouth. "When you put it that way, it sounds cold." "Maybe it is. I won't lie to you, Eloise. This wasn't a love match. But it doesn't have to be a miserable one either. I intend to be a good husband, to provide for you, protect you, treat you with respect. In time, maybe we can build something more. And if we can't, then you'll still have security, comfort, and your own space. I meant what I said. I won't touch you unless you ask. Won't force anything on you that you don't want." Eloise studied him across the length of the table, the stranger who'd paid her father's debts and made her his wife. He didn't look like a liar, didn't sound like one either, but how could she trust a man whose reputation was built on being merciless? "People say you're cruel," she said quietly, "that you destroy anyone who crosses you." Graham's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "People say a lot of things. Some of them are even true. I've been hard when I needed to be. I've defended what's mine and punished those who tried to take it. Does that make me cruel or just practical in rough country?" "I don't know," Eloise admitted. "I don't know you well enough to say." "No, you don't. And I don't know you either. We're strangers bound by a transaction and a ceremony." He stood then, moving with that same careful deliberation she'd noticed before. "But we have time, Eloise. Time to learn each other. Time to see if we can make something of this arrangement. I'm willing to be patient if you are." He came around the table but stopped several feet away, not crowding her. Up close, she could see the weariness in his face, lines that spoke of long days and hard work. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps late 30s rather than the 40-some years his gray-shot hair suggested. "You should rest," he said quietly. "It's been a long day, and I imagine you're exhausted. I'll be up early tomorrow, always am, but you sleep as long as you need. Mrs. Brennan will see you get breakfast whenever you wake." Then he was gone, leaving Eloise alone in the dining room of her new home, married to a man she feared and didn't understand, facing a future she couldn't begin to predict. She made her way upstairs, found her room again, and changed out of the wedding dress into a simple nightgown her mother had packed. The bed was comfortable, more comfortable than any she'd slept in before, but sleep was a long time coming. Through her window, she could see lights in the distant barns, hear the sounds of the ranch settling for the night. Somewhere out there, Graham Calder was checking on his cattle, his horses, his empire of grass and sky. And tomorrow, Eloise would wake up as his wife, as mistress of this vast ranch, trapped in a bargain made of desperation and debt. But as she finally drifted toward sleep, one thought kept circling back. He'd given her her own room, had promised not to touch her without permission, had spoken of respect and patience. The monster she'd feared didn't quite match the man who'd made those promises. Maybe, just maybe, Graham Calder was as much a stranger to his own reputation as she was to him. And maybe in time she'd find out which version was real, the merciless cattle baron or the careful man who'd given his word and seemed intent on keeping it. Only time would tell which Graham Calder she'd truly married. Morning came too early, announced by roosters, and the distant sounds of men beginning their day. Eloise woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until the unfamiliar ceiling came into focus, high and white, crossed with dark beams. Not her childhood bedroom, not her home anymore. She was Mrs. Graham Calder now, mistress of a ranch that felt more like a small kingdom, wife to a man whose reputation preceded him like thunder before a storm. The house was quiet as she dressed in one of the simple day dresses her mother had packed, her fingers clumsy on the buttons. Through her window, she could see the ranch already alive with activity, cowboys moving between buildings, horses being led from the barn, the whole operation running with a precision that suggested years of established routine. She found her way downstairs, following the smell of coffee and bacon, to a kitchen that was easily 3 times the size of her mother's. Mrs. Brennan stood at the stove, humming something tuneless under her breath. "Good morning, Mrs. Calder," the housekeeper said cheerfully. "You're up earlier than I expected. Sit yourself down and I'll get you some breakfast. Please call me Eloise." She slid into a chair at the small table tucked in the corner, a more intimate space than the formal dining room. "Has Mr. Calder already eaten?" "Graham's been up since before dawn, dear. He takes coffee and biscuits early, then has a proper breakfast around 8 with the hands." Mrs. Brennan set a plate in front of her, eggs, bacon, fresh bread that was still warm. "He keeps long hours, that one. First up, last to bed most nights." Eloise picked at her food, stomach tight with nerves. What does he expect me to do? What are my duties?" Mrs. Brennan paused in her work, turning to face her with a thoughtful expression. "He didn't say exactly. Just told me to make sure you were comfortable and had whatever you needed. I suppose you'll figure it out together as you go." It was a non-answer that left Eloise feeling more adrift than before. At her family's ranch, every day had held clear purpose. Chickens to feed, garden to tend, meals to prepare, endless tasks that kept hands busy and minds focused. Here, in this well-run household with its efficient housekeeper and numerous ranch hands, she couldn't quite see where she was meant to fit. She was finishing her coffee when heavy footsteps sounded in the hall. Graham appeared in the doorway, hat in hand, dust already coating his boots despite the early hour. He stopped when he saw her, something unreadable crossing his face. "You're up," he said, as if this surprised him. "I'm used to early mornings." He nodded, shifted his weight slightly. "I'm heading out to check the north pastures. Fences need mending before we rotate the herd. I'll be back around supper." "All right." Eloise didn't know what else to say. Was she supposed to ask to come along, stay here and learn the house? The rules of this strange new life weren't clear. Graham lingered in the doorway a moment longer, then seemed to make a decision. "You're welcome to ride out if you want. Explore the place, get a sense of the land. Just let one of the hands know so they don't worry. I... Yes. Thank you. Another nod, and he was gone, leaving Eloise alone with Mrs. Brennan and the echo of his boots on the wooden floor. The housekeeper chuckled softly. He's not much for conversation, our Graham, but he means well. You'll see. Eloise spent that first morning exploring the house, memorizing the layout of rooms that seemed designed for a family much larger than two people. A library with more books than she'd seen outside of the general store in town. A parlor with furniture too fine to have traveled by wagon. A music room with a piano that looked like it had never been played. The keys pristine and dust-free only because Mrs. Brennan clearly kept it polished. He bought that 5 years back, Mrs. Brennan said when she noticed Eloise staring at the instrument. Said a proper house should have music in it, but Graham doesn't play, and we've never had anyone else here who did. I played a little when I was younger, Eloise admitted, before we had to sell our piano. Well then, Mrs. Brennan smiled. Perhaps that's one reason you're here, to fill this big house with something besides silence. After lunch, Eloise did what Graham had suggested, borrowed a gentle mare from the barn, and rode out to see the ranch. A young cowboy with red hair and an easy smile offered to accompany her. Name's Colton, ma'am. I can show you the boundaries if you'd like, help you get your bearings. They rode for hours, Colton pointing out landmarks and explaining the ranch's operation with the enthusiasm of someone who loved his work. The Calder Ranch was even larger than she'd realized. Thousands of acres stretching to the mountain foothills, with cattle scattered across pastures that seemed to go on forever. Mr. Calder built all this himself? She asked, pausing at a rise that offered views in every direction. Most of it, ma'am. He came here 15 years ago with nothing but a horse and determination. Bought the land when nobody else wanted it, too far from town, too wild, but he saw what it could be. Colton's admiration was obvious. Now it's the most successful operation in 3 counties. He's fair too, pays better than most, treats the hands decent. Some of us have been here near 10 years. But people in town speak of him differently, Eloise said carefully. They say he's ruthless. Colton's expression grew serious. He's hard when he needs to be, ma'am. This country doesn't forgive weakness. There have been men who tried to take what wasn't theirs, rustle cattle, burn pastures, intimidate the smaller ranchers into selling cheap so they could squeeze Mr. Calder out. He dealt with them. The young cowboy met her eyes. But he never started trouble, only finished it. That's not ruthless, that's survival. They rode back as the sun lowered, painting the mountains gold and purple. Eloise found herself thinking about what Colton had said, trying to reconcile the feared reputation with this picture of a man who'd built something from nothing and protected it fiercely. Graham was coming in from the north pastures when they reached the barn. He sat tall in the saddle, shoulders straight despite what must have been hours of hard work. His eyes found Eloise immediately, and he swung down from his horse with practiced ease. You rode out. It wasn't a question, but there was something in his tone, approval, maybe, or relief. Colton showed me the ranch. It's impressive. It's home. Graham handed his reins to a waiting hand, then turned back to Eloise. You ride well. My father taught me young. On a ranch, even a small one, you need to know how to handle a horse. Something that might have been respect flickered in his gray eyes. Your father raised you practical then. He raised me to work, if that's what you mean. Graham studied her for a long moment, and Eloise had the distinct impression he was reassessing something, adjusting his understanding of who she was. Good, he said finally. There's always work here if you want it, though you don't have to. Mrs. Brennan runs the house fine on her own. I need to do something, Eloise admitted. I'm not accustomed to idleness. A ghost of a smile touched his mouth. Then we'll find you something. Come on, supper should be ready. They fell into a pattern over the following days, circling each other carefully, like two horses learning to work in harness together. Graham left early and returned late, always courteous but distant, respecting the boundaries he'd promised. Eloise explored more of the ranch, began helping Mrs. Brennan in the garden, offered to take over some of the household bookkeeping when she noticed the ledgers stacked on Graham's desk. You know numbers? He asked that evening, finding her in his study with the accounts spread before her. My father taught me. Someone had to track expenses and income, and Mother never had the patience for it. Graham leaned against the doorframe, watching her work with an expression she couldn't quite read. "The books are a mess," he admitted. "I understand cattle and land, but paperwork?" He trailed off with a slight grimace. "I can see that." Eloise tapped a column where the numbers didn't add up. "You're losing track of small expenses. It adds up over time. Can you fix it?" "I can organize it properly, yes, if you want me to." "I'd be grateful." He pushed away from the door, came closer, but still maintained that careful distance. "Eloise, I know this isn't what you would have chosen, but I'm glad you're here. Glad you're finding ways to make this place yours." The words were simple, but something in how he said them, with a quiet sincerity that seemed at odds with his fearsome reputation, made Eloise's throat tight. "I'm trying," she said softly. "It's strange being here, but it's not terrible." "High praise," Graham said, and this time the smile was real, brief as summer lightning, but genuine. "I'll take it." As the weeks passed, Eloise began to see the contradictions more clearly. The man the town feared was the same man who spent an hour one afternoon trying to save a calf that had been rejected by its mother, feeding it by hand with a patience that seemed infinite. The ruthless cattle baron was the same person who paid his hands generously, made sure they had good food and decent lodging, and never asked them to do work he wouldn't do himself. She watched him one morning from the kitchen window, working alongside his cowboys to repair a section of fence damaged in a storm. He moved with the same steady competence as the others, lifting posts and hammering with the practiced rhythm of someone who'd done hard labor all his life. When one of the younger hands made a mistake, Graham simply showed him the right way without anger or mockery. "He's always been like that," Mrs. Brennan said, coming to stand beside her. "Works harder than anyone else, never asks for special treatment just because he owns the place. The men respect that." "But why do people in town fear him?" Eloise asked, voicing the question that had been growing louder in her mind. "Everything I see here contradicts what I was told about him." Mrs. Brennan was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "There was trouble a few years back. A man named Sutton tried to take over some of the smaller ranches, forcing folks to sell by burning their pastures, scattering their herds. Graham stood up to him, protected the smaller operations, organized the ranchers to fight back. Sutton ended up ruined, lost everything, and left the territory. And people blame Graham for that? Some do. Say he was too ruthless in how he handled it, but what they don't talk about is that Sutton started it, that Graham was just protecting what was his and helping neighbors who couldn't defend themselves alone." The housekeeper's voice held conviction. "Graham could have let it happen, could have waited until Sutton forced everyone out and then bought their land cheap, would have doubled his holdings for a fraction of the cost, but that's not who he is." Eloise absorbed this, another piece of the puzzle that was her husband. Why doesn't he defend himself? Why let people think the worst? Pride, maybe. Or just exhaustion. It takes energy to care what people think, and Graham puts all his energy into this ranch. Mrs. Brennan patted her arm. "But you're seeing the real man now. That's what matters." That evening, Eloise found Graham in the library, reading by lamplight. She paused in the doorway, suddenly uncertain. "Come in," he said without looking up. "You don't need permission to enter any room in this house. It's your home, too." She moved into the room, drawn by curiosity to see what he was reading. Poetry, she realized with surprise. Longfellow. "You like poetry?" The question came out before she could stop it. Graham looked up, and for once he didn't seem guarded. "Surprises you?" "Everything about you surprises me," Eloise admitted honestly. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect? A monster?" There was no accusation in his voice, just genuine curiosity. "Yes," she said quietly. "That's exactly what I expected." He closed the book, gave her his full attention. "And now?" "Now I don't know what to think. I watch you work alongside your men, see how they respect you. I hear Mrs. Brennan defend you fiercely. I see you save rejected calves and read Longfellow in the evening. It doesn't match what people said." Graham was silent for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "People believe what they want to believe. I'm successful, and success makes enemies. I've been hard when necessary, and that gives people ammunition to paint me however they like. I stopped trying to control the narrative years ago. But doesn't it bother you, having people think you're cruel when you're not? Are you certain I'm not? He asked it seriously, no jest in his tone. You've been here a few weeks, Eloise. You've seen the easy parts, the ranch running smoothly, the men content, no trouble brewing. But when trouble does come, I handle it with whatever force necessary. That's not always pretty, that's not always kind. There's a difference between being hard and being cruel, Eloise countered. Between defending what's yours and destroying for the pleasure of it. Something shifted in Graham's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or something deeper. You've thought about this. I've had time to think about little else. Trying to understand who I married, what kind of man I've bound myself to. She moved closer, emboldened by the softness of lamplight and the quiet intimacy of the library. And I'm beginning to think that Graham Calder is a far better man than his reputation suggests. Don't make me a saint, he said quietly. I'm not. I've done hard things, hurt people who stood in my way. The difference is, I sleep fine afterward because they earned it. That's not cruelty, that's just frontier justice, I suppose. This isn't Boston or Philadelphia. Out here, you protect what's yours or you lose it. Graham studied her with those winter storm eyes, and Eloise felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing. You understand that. Really understand it. I grew up on a ranch, Graham, a small one, but I know how hard this life is. Know what it costs to carve something from wilderness and drought. Know that sometimes you have to be harder than you want to be just to survive. She paused. My father had to let good men go because he couldn't afford to pay them. Had to watch his herd dwindle because he couldn't afford feed. In the end, he had to sell me to save what his father built. You think I don't understand hard choices? The words came out more bitter than she'd intended, and she saw them land, saw Graham flinch slightly at her phrasing. He didn't sell you, Graham said firmly. He made a bargain to save his family's legacy. There's a difference. Is there? I'm here because you paid his debts. That sounds like a transaction to me. It was a transaction. Graham didn't soften it, didn't try to make it prettier than it was. But it was one you agreed to, and one I entered hoping for more than just a wife in name. I wanted a partner, Eloise, someone who could understand this life, this ranch, what it takes to maintain it. Your father said you were sensible and strong. He was right. The compliment, delivered with such matter-of-fact certainty, caught her off guard. You don't know me well enough to say that. I'm learning, and what I've learned so far, it's more than I hoped for when I made that offer. He stood then, setting the book aside, and took a step closer, still maintaining distance, still careful, but closing the gap slightly. You've been here 3 weeks, and already you've organized the accounts, helped Mrs. Brennan expand the garden, started teaching Colton to read in the evenings. The men like you. The place feels different with you in it. Different how? Less empty. The words were quiet, almost reluctant, as if he wasn't used to admitting such things. I built this ranch into something impressive, but it's been hollow, a showcase with nobody to appreciate it. Now it feels like it might become a home instead of just a headquarters. Eloise's heart did something complicated in her chest. Is that what you want? A home? Doesn't everyone? Graham asked softly. Even men with terrible reputations? She found herself smiling despite everything. I suppose even monsters want to come in from the cold. Especially monsters. He returned the smile, and Eloise realized it was the first time she'd seen him truly smile. Not the brief flickers or ghost of humor, but an actual smile that reached his eyes and softened his whole face. It transformed him, made him look younger and somehow more vulnerable. They stood that way for a moment, the library warm and quiet around them, something shifting in the space between them. Not love. It was far too soon for that, but perhaps the beginning of understanding, the first tentative threads of connection. I should let you get back to your reading, Eloise said finally, though part of her didn't want to leave. I was nearly finished anyway, but Eloise, he stopped her as she turned toward the door. Thank you for trying, for giving this a chance instead of just enduring it. It means more than you probably realize. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and slipped from the room. But as she climbed the stairs to her bedroom, her separate solitary bedroom, She found herself thinking about that smile, about the loneliness she'd heard beneath his words, about the way his eyes had softened when he'd called the ranch hollow. Graham Calder had everything: land, wealth, success, and somehow it had left him empty. And she, who'd had so little, had been raised in a home rich with love despite the financial struggles. They'd approached this marriage from opposite directions, but maybe, just maybe, they could meet somewhere in the middle. The next morning brought the first real test of who Graham was beneath the reputation. Eloise was helping Mrs. Brennan with breakfast when angry voices erupted from the yard, men shouting, someone cursing. She rushed to the window in time to see 3 strangers on horseback confronting Graham near the barn. "That's Merrick and his boys," Mrs. Brennan said grimly. "Trouble." Before Eloise could ask what kind of trouble, Graham's voice cut through the commotion, cold and hard in a way she hadn't heard before. "You're on my land without permission, Merrick. State your business or get out." "Your fence cut through my water access," the lead rider snarled. "You've got no right." "I've got every right. Survey shows the creek is on my property, has been since the territory was mapped. You want water, you ask permission, or you find another source." "We've been using that creek for 3 years. "You've been trespassing for 3 years. I was willing to overlook it, but last week someone cut my north fence and scattered my herd. I had to spend 2 days rounding them up." Graham's voice was deadly calm. "That stops now. Use the creek again without asking, and I'll have the sheriff involved." "You threatening me, Calder?" "No. I'm informing you of consequences. There's a difference." The confrontation escalated, harsh words flying back and forth. Eloise watched, heart pounding, as Graham stood his ground against 3 mounted men. He didn't back down, didn't show fear, just faced them with that same cold determination she'd seen in his eyes when he'd spoken of protecting what was his. Finally, Merrick spat in the dirt and wheeled his horse around. "This ain't over, Calder." "It is, unless you want it to be something more serious. Your choice." The 3 riders left in a cloud of dust and fury. The ranch hands dispersed slowly, muttering among themselves. And Graham stood alone in the yard, hands on his hips, watching until the riders disappeared from sight. Eloise found herself moving without thinking, out the door and across the yard to where he stood. He turned at her approach, and she saw the tension in his shoulders, the hardness that hadn't quite left his eyes. "You all right?" he asked, which surprised her. She should be asking him that question. "I'm fine, but Graham, is there going to be trouble?" "Maybe. Probably not. Merrick's all bluster and he knows he's in the wrong. But men like him don't like being called on their behavior. He might make noise, try to save face." Graham's jaw tightened. "This is what I meant, Eloise. This is the part that's not pretty. Sometimes you have to stand hard, draw lines, be willing to follow through with consequences. Makes you unpopular. Makes people whisper about how ruthless Graham Calder is." "You were defending your property," Eloise said firmly. "Standing up to someone who is stealing from you. That's not ruthless, that's necessary." Graham looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Most people don't see it that way. They hear about confrontations like this and assume I'm the aggressor, the bully using my size and success to intimidate smaller operations." "But you're not. He was stealing your water, cut your fence, scattered your cattle. You had every right to—" "I know I had the right," Graham interrupted gently, "but rights don't change perception. People will hear Merrick's version in town, how big, mean Graham Calder threatened him over a little creek water. They won't hear that he's been trespassing for years or that someone sabotaged my fences." Eloise felt anger flare in her chest, not at Graham, but at the unfairness of it, the way his reputation painted every action in the worst possible light. "Then we'll tell them the truth." "We won't," Graham said firmly but not unkindly. "Because defending yourself just makes you look defensive, and people believe what they want to believe anyway. Better to let it go, keep my head down, and handle problems as they come." "But that's not fair." "No, it's not. But it's reality." He reached out, then seemed to think better of it, his hand dropping back to his side. "Don't worry about it, Eloise. I've dealt with worse than Merrick. He'll bluster for a while, then move on to easier targets." But worry she did, especially as the days passed and she heard the gossip. Mrs. Brennan returned from town with stories of how Merrick was painting himself as the victim, how people were clucking their tongues about poor Mr. Merrick being bullied by the powerful Calder Ranch. Graham just shrugged when she mentioned it, told her to ignore it, went about his work as if the rumors didn't exist. Yet Eloise noticed things. The way his shoulders tensed when he rode to town for supplies. The careful distance he maintained from other ranchers at the feed store. The quiet resignation in his eyes when someone crossed the street to avoid speaking to him. Graham Calder had built an empire and paid for it with isolation. And watching him bear that burden alone, with quiet dignity and without complaint, made something shift in Eloise's heart. A softening, a protective instinct, a growing certainty that her husband deserved better than the hand life had dealt him. One evening, nearly 6 weeks after their wedding, Eloise was working on the accounts in the study when Graham came in, looking more tired than usual. He poured himself a whiskey, drank it standing by the window, staring out at the darkening mountains. "Long day?" she asked softly. "Long enough." He rolled his shoulders, working out tension. Lost 2 calves to wolves, found another section of fence cut, had to ride to town and listen to Morrison lecture me about maintaining good relations with neighbors. His laugh was bitter, as if I'm the one creating problems. Eloise set down her pen, really looking at him, at the exhaustion in the lines of his face, the way he held himself like a man carrying weight no one else could see. "Graham, why do you stay here? Why not sell the ranch? Move somewhere you could start fresh without all this history." He turned from the window, surprised by the question. "This is my home. Everything I've worked for is here. But you're alone, isolated, fighting constant battles to protect what's yours while everyone assumes the worst about you." She stood, moved closer. "Is it worth it?" Graham was quiet for a long time, whiskey glass forgotten in his hand. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft and raw in a way she'd never heard. "I thought it was. Thought if I just kept my head down, worked hard, built something impressive enough, that eventually people would see past the reputation. But they don't. They never do. Success just makes them more certain I must have achieved it through ruthless means. So why stay?" "Because," he trailed off, struggling with something, "because leaving feels like admitting defeat, letting them win, proving that they were right to push me to the margins, to treat me like an outcast, and because until recently, I had nowhere else to go and no one to go with." His eyes found hers, held them. "That's changed now." The implications hung in the air between them. Eloise's heart beat faster. "Graham." "I know we married for practical reasons," he continued, words coming faster now, as if he'd been holding them in too long. "I know this wasn't your choice, not really. But Eloise, having you here, it's made me remember what I was working for in the first place. Not just to prove something or to build an empire, but to create something worth having. A home, a family, something that matters beyond just acreage and head counts." Eloise couldn't speak, couldn't find words for the tangle of emotions in her chest. She'd spent weeks watching this man, learning him, seeing past the reputation to the person beneath. And somewhere along the way, without quite realizing it, her fear had transformed into something else entirely. "You're not what they say you are," she finally managed. "You're not cruel or ruthless or monstrous. You're just lonely and tired of fighting alone." Graham's expression cracked, revealing something vulnerable beneath. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who's paying attention." She took the final steps separating them, close enough now to see the silver threading through his dark hair, the lines around his eyes, the weariness he carried like an old coat. "Graham, you don't have to do this alone anymore. That's what marriage means, isn't it? Partners, facing things together." "Is that what you want?" he asked quietly. "To be true partners, not just occupants of the same house?" Eloise thought about the careful distance they'd maintained, the separate rooms, the polite boundaries. Thought about her fear on their wedding day and how it had slowly dissolved over weeks of watching him be kind to injured animals, patient with young cowboys, gentle in ways that belied his reputation. Thought about that smile in the library, the loneliness in his words, the careful respect he'd shown her every single day. "I think," she said slowly, honestly, "that I'd like to try. To really try. Not just endure." Something transformed in Graham's face. Hope. Bright and fragile as first light. He set down his glass with hands that weren't quite steady. Eloise, I need you to be certain, because once we cross this line, once we become more than strangers sharing a name, there's no going back to careful distance. And I can't invest in something that's only going to break me later. She heard the fear beneath his words, understood that this powerful man who faced down rustlers and wolves and social isolation was terrified of something far simpler, of hoping for connection and having it rejected. I'm here, she said, reaching out to touch his arm, feeling the strength there beneath the worn cotton of his shirt. I'm here, and I'm not afraid anymore. Not of you, not of this. Whatever people say, whatever trouble comes, we'll face it together. Graham looked at her hand on his arm, then slowly, carefully, covered it with his own. His palm was rough and warm, and when his fingers closed around hers, Eloise felt the last of her fear evaporate like morning dew under summer sun. I don't deserve this, he said roughly. Don't deserve you giving me a chance after what I— You saved my family's ranch, Eloise interrupted. You've been patient and kind and respectful, even when you didn't have to be. You've shown me who you really are, Graham. And what I see is a good man carrying an unfair burden. You deserve someone who sees that, someone who wants to help carry it. His hand tightened on hers, and for a moment she thought he might pull her closer, might kiss her the way husbands kiss wives. But he didn't. Instead, he just held her hand like it was something precious, something he was afraid might disappear if he moved too quickly. Thank you, he whispered, for seeing past it all, for trying. They stood that way as darkness fell completely outside, two people learning to bridge the gap between strangers and something more, between fear and trust, between isolation and connection. The road ahead would be long and uncertain, but for the first time since her wedding day, Eloise felt something bloom in her chest that might have been hope. Graham Calder wasn't the monster she'd feared. He was just a man, flawed and weary and desperately lonely, trying to build something worth having in unforgiving country. And maybe, just maybe, she was exactly the partner he needed to finally succeed. The days following that evening in the study carried a different quality, as if the air between them had changed composition. Still careful, but warmer now, charged with possibility. Graham still rose before dawn and worked until exhaustion claimed him. But he began taking meals with Eloise more regularly, lingering over coffee to talk about the day's plans, or asking her opinion on ranch decisions. Small things, perhaps, but they felt monumental to Eloise, like watching ice break on a frozen river, revealing the current that had been flowing beneath all along. She caught him watching her sometimes, when she was working in the garden or reviewing the accounts, or teaching young Colton his letters in the evening. His expression during these moments held something she couldn't quite name, a mix of wonder and wariness, as if he couldn't believe she was real and feared she might vanish if he looked away. You're staring, she told him one afternoon, glancing up from the ledger to find those gray eyes fixed on her. Graham didn't look embarrassed, just thoughtful. I'm trying to figure out what I did to deserve this. This? You. Here. Actually wanting to stay instead of counting days until you can escape. He leaned against the desk, close enough that she could smell the sun and sage on his skin. Every morning I wake up expecting to find you've changed your mind, realized what a mistake this was. That's a bleak way to start each day, Eloise observed, setting down her pen. Graham, I told you I was here. I meant it. I know you did. But knowing and believing are different things when you've spent years with people keeping their distance, waiting for you to prove their worst assumptions right. He paused, seemed to struggle with something. Eloise, I need you to understand. If you're going to be my true partner in this, there will be hard times. Confrontations like the one with Merrick, probably worse. People will judge you for standing beside me. They'll whisper about you the way they whisper about me. Let them whisper, she said firmly. I grew up knowing what it meant to be on the outside, Graham. My family was never wealthy enough to matter in town society, never poor enough to be pitied. We existed in the middle, noticed only when we failed to pay a bill on time. I'm not afraid of gossip. Something shifted in his expression. Relief, perhaps, or gratitude. You're stronger than you look. I'd have to be, married to you. She meant it lightly, but Graham's face grew serious. Yes, he said quietly. You would. The following weeks saw their partnership deepen in practical ways. Graham began consulting her on ranch decisions, valuing her perspective on everything from which cattle to sell to how to handle a dispute between two of the hands. Eloise took over the bookkeeping entirely, organized the household accounts, and started making improvements to the house that reflected her own taste. Curtains in the windows, flowers on the table, small touches that made the place feel lived in rather than simply occupied. Mrs. Brennan watched these developments with obvious approval. "It's good to see this house coming alive," she told Eloise one morning while they worked together preserving vegetables. Graham needed someone who'd make it a home instead of just a headquarters. "He works so hard," Eloise said, slicing beans with practiced efficiency. "Sometimes I wonder if he even notices the changes." "Oh, he notices." The housekeeper's smile was knowing. "He just doesn't always know how to say so. That man's better with actions than words, always has been." As if to prove the point, Eloise found evidence of Graham's wordless consideration everywhere. A new mare appeared in the barn, a beautiful chestnut with a gentle disposition, perfect for her skill level. Books she'd mentioned wanting to read materialized in the library. The piano was tuned and fresh sheet music appeared on the stand. He never made a show of these gestures, never drew attention to them, but they accumulated like a language she was learning to read. Then came the storm that would change everything. It started as a distant rumble on a sweltering August afternoon, clouds building over the mountains with ominous speed. Eloise was in the garden when the first wind hit, strong enough to bend the young corn stalks nearly horizontal. "Storm's coming in fast," Colton called from the barn, already moving to secure loose equipment. "Looks like it'll be a bad one." Within an hour, the sky had turned the color of old bruises, and the wind howled like something alive and angry. Graham came riding in hard, already soaked despite having been gone only since midday. "We need to move the herd in the north pasture," he told the assembled hands, water streaming from his hat brim. "Creek's already rising, and if it floods, they'll be trapped against the fence line. We go now, get them to higher ground before it's too late." "Graham, it's too dangerous," Eloise heard herself say, moving to his side. "The lightning—" "I know." His jaw was set, that stubborn determination she recognized. "But I've got 200 head up there, including breeding stock I can't afford to lose. We go now, or we lose them." "Then I'm coming with you." His head snapped toward her. "Absolutely not. You need every available hand, and I can ride as well as most of your cowboys." She met his eyes steadily, refusing to back down. "I'm not staying here wondering if you're alive or dead while I could be helping." Graham looked like he wanted to argue, but another crack of thunder decided the matter. "Fine, but you stay back from the creek, understand? You see the water rising too fast, you ride for high ground immediately." They rode out into the teeth of the storm, 8 riders against nature's fury. The rain came down in sheets, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few yards ahead. Lightning split the sky with terrible frequency, each crack illuminating the landscape in stark white flashes. The cattle were already spooked, milling nervously as the creek beside them swelled with alarming speed. "Spread out," Graham shouted over the wind. "Push them east, away from the water, slow and steady. Don't spook them into running." It was brutal, exhausting work. The cattle resisted, confused by the storm, and the rain made every surface treacherous. Eloise's horse slipped twice, and she had to trust the animal's instincts to keep them both upright. Her clothes were plastered to her skin within minutes, cold despite the summer heat, and her hands ached from gripping the reins. They'd been working perhaps half an hour, making slow progress, when Eloise heard a sound that made her blood freeze, a deep roar like nothing she'd heard before. She turned toward the creek and saw, illuminated by lightning, a wall of water surging down from the mountains. Flash flood, her mind supplied. The creek had become a river in minutes, and it was still rising. "Graham!" she screamed, but the wind tore his name away. He'd seen it too. "Move them! Move them now!" His voice carried over the storm through sheer force of will. "Get to high ground!" The cattle panicked, finally breaking into the run the cowboys had been trying to prevent. But now that was exactly what they needed, the herd thundering east towards safety, away from the deadly water. The riders followed, pushing stragglers, keeping the mass moving in the right direction. Eloise was focused on a calf that had become separated from its mother when she heard Colton's shout. Mr. Calder's down. The creek's got Mr. Calder. Her heart stopped. She wheeled her horse around and saw Graham in the water, his horse nowhere in sight. He must have gotten too close to the edge had the bank collapsed beneath him. The current had him, was pulling him downstream toward where the creek narrowed into rapids. Every instinct screamed at her to be careful, to wait for the other men, to not risk herself. But she saw Graham go under, saw him surface gasping, saw the water pull him toward the rocks, an instinct lost to something stronger, the certain knowledge that she couldn't lose him, not now, not after finally finding someone who saw her as more than just practical or sensible, who looked at her like she mattered. She drove her horse toward the creek, ignoring Colton's warning shouts. The water was already above the banks, spreading across what had been dry ground minutes before. Her mare balked, terrified, but Eloise forced her forward, trusting that the animal's survival instinct would keep them both from being swept away. Graham! She reached the edge where the current wasn't quite as strong, saw him struggling perhaps 20 yards downstream, being pulled inexorably toward the rapids. Without thinking, without planning, she urged her horse into the shallower edge of the flood, leaned down, and grabbed for the rope coiled on her saddle. Her fingers were numb with cold, clumsy, but she managed to free the rope and swing it toward Graham. It fell short. She reeled it in, tried again. The third throw caught him, and she felt his weight pull against her grip as he grabbed hold. "Tie it!" she screamed. "Tie it around yourself." He did somehow, even as the water tried to tear him away. The mare was struggling against the current, driven by terror but holding her ground. Eloise wrapped the rope around her saddle horn and urged the horse backward, away from the deadly pull of the creek. It seemed to take forever. Graham was dead weight in the water, exhausted from fighting the current. The mare slipped twice, nearly went down, but somehow kept her footing. Inch by agonizing inch, they pulled him out of the main current, into the shallower flooding, finally onto ground that wasn't trying to sweep them all away to death. Hands appeared. Colton and the other cowboys grabbing Graham, pulling him clear, untying the rope with shaking fingers. Someone caught Eloise as she slid from her saddle, legs too weak to hold her. Graham was on his hands and knees, coughing up water, gasping for air. He looked half-drowned, clothes torn, blood on his temple from where he'd hit something in the current. But he was alive. They were both alive. "You crazy woman," he rasped when he could speak, looking up at her with wild eyes. "You could have died. So could you. Could." Her voice shook. "Your horse." Thrown, bank collapsed. He coughed again, struggled to his feet with Colton's help. "Eloise, you shouldn't have." "Don't." She cut him off, suddenly furious, all the fear and adrenaline transforming into anger. "Don't you dare tell me I shouldn't have saved your life. Don't you dare lecture me about safety when you ride into storms to save cattle." Graham stared at her, water streaming down his face, and something raw and unguarded filled his expression. "I couldn't lose a single head," he said roughly. "The ranch—" "To hell with the ranch." The words burst from her before she could stop them. "To hell with the cattle and the land and everything else. Graham, you almost died. Do you understand that? You were seconds from those rapids, from being dashed against rocks, and all you can think about is not losing cattle." "It's my life's work," he protested, but his voice had lost its conviction. "And it's meaningless if you're dead." Eloise was shaking now, cold and terrified and furious all at once. "What good is this empire you've built if there's no one left to share it with? What's the point of all this if you throw your life away over 200 head of cattle?" "Eloise, no." She moved closer, heedless of the watching cowboys, of the storm still raging around them. "You told me you wanted a partner. You said having me here made you remember what you were working for. Was that a lie? Because partners don't sacrifice themselves needlessly. Partners think about each other, about the life they're building together." Graham stood frozen, lightning illuminating the emotions warring in his face, shock, realization, and something deeper, something that made Eloise's breath catch despite her anger. "You're right," he said hoarsely. "God help me, you're right. Of course I'm right." Her voice broke on the words. "Graham, I just watched you nearly die, and all I could think was that I couldn't bear it. Couldn't bear losing you now that I've finally found you. Does that not matter?" The space between them seemed to collapse. Graham reached for her, and Eloise went to him without hesitation, his arms closing around her with a fierceness that spoke of his own fear, his own realization of how close he'd come to losing everything. "I never wanted to buy you," he whispered against her wet hair, voice raw with emotion. "That was never what I wanted. I wanted a chance, Eloise. Just a chance with you. To see if maybe, somehow, a woman like you could look past everything, the reputation, the isolation, all of it, and see me. Really see me." Eloise pulled back just enough to look at his face, at the vulnerability written there in lines she was learning to read. "I see you, Graham. I've been seeing you for weeks now, and what I see is a good man who's been alone too long, who's forgotten that some things matter more than land and cattle and proving yourself to people who'll never give you credit anyway." "You matter more," he said, and the certainty in his voice made her throat tight. "I know that now. You matter more than all of it." "Then prove it," she challenged. "Stop treating this place like it's all that matters. Stop sacrificing yourself on the altar of other people's expectations. Live, Graham. Really live, not just survive." He studied her face like he was memorizing every feature, his hands still holding her close despite the rain and the watching men and everything else. "I don't know how," he admitted. "I've spent so long just pushing forward, just working to maintain what I've built. I've forgotten what it feels like to want something more than mere success." "Then learn." She reached up, touched his face, felt the rough stubble and the cold rain and the warmth of his skin beneath. "We'll learn together. That's what partners do." Something broke in Graham's expression, the last walls coming down, the final defenses crumbling. He leaned down, and Eloise met him halfway, their lips finding each other with a desperation that spoke of nearly losing what they'd barely begun to build. The kiss was cold and wet, and tasted of rain and river water, and it was the most real thing Eloise had ever experienced. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the storm was beginning to ease. The worst had passed, leaving them standing in the aftermath, battered but alive, separate but finally truly connected. "We should get you both inside," Colton said quietly, his young face uncertain how to react to what he'd just witnessed. "You'll catch your death out here." Graham nodded but didn't let go of Eloise. "The herd, safe on high ground," one of the other hands reported. "Lost maybe 3 head when they panicked, but the rest made it. Your wife's quick thinking saved more than just you, boss." Wife. The word seemed to settle around Eloise like a cloak, but this time it felt right instead of foreign. She was Graham's wife, not in name only anymore, but in truth. The woman who'd ridden into a flood to save him, who'd shouted sense into him in front of his men, who'd kissed him like the world was ending because for a moment it nearly had. They rode back to the house slowly, Graham on a borrowed horse, staying close to Eloise as if afraid she might disappear. The other hands gave them space, perhaps sensing that something fundamental had shifted between the boss and his wife, that the careful distance they'd maintained was gone forever. Mrs. Brennan met them at the door, gasping at their condition. "Sweet mercy, what happened?" "Creek flooded," Graham said simply. "Eloise saved my life." The housekeeper's eyes went wide, but she recovered quickly, ushering them both inside with the efficiency of a battlefield nurse. "Hot baths, both of you, immediately. I'll have food ready when you're warmed through. Go on now, before you both catch pneumonia." Eloise started toward the stairs, then realized Graham was following her. She paused, turned back. "Graham?" He stopped, something uncertain crossing his face. "I thought, can I—" He trailed off, uncharacteristically at a loss for words. Understanding bloomed warm in Eloise's chest. She reached for his hand, laced her fingers through his. "My room or yours?" Relief flooded his features. "Yours is closer." They climbed the stairs together, still dripping water on Mrs. Brennan's clean floors, but neither cared. The housekeeper had laid out towels and started filling the bathing tub, then discreetly disappeared. Eloise began peeling off her soaked clothing with fingers that still shook slightly from cold and adrenaline. Graham turned away, giving her privacy, but she stopped him with a touch on his arm. "You don't have to look away. We're married, remember?" "I know, but I said I wouldn't. That was before." She kept her voice gentle but firm. "Before tonight. Before I nearly lost you. Before we both finally admitted what we've been dancing around for weeks. Graham, look at me. He did, slowly turning, his eyes finding hers and holding them even as she continued undressing. There was nothing lascivious in his gaze, just wonder and something that might have been reverence, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real and choosing him. "You're shaking," he observed quietly. "So are you." They helped each other then, fumbling with buttons and laces with cold, numbed fingers, carefully checking for injuries from their ordeal. Graham had a nasty gash on his temple that would need tending, and Eloise's hands were scraped raw from the rope. They'd both have spectacular bruises by morning. The bath was hot enough to sting, and they took turns warming through while the storm finally spent itself outside. By the time they were both clean and dry, wearing the robes Mrs. Brennan had thoughtfully provided, exhaustion was setting in. "Food first," Graham insisted when Eloise swayed on her feet. "Then rest." They ate in her room, simple soup and bread that Mrs. Brennan brought up with a knowing look and no comment. The food warmed them from the inside, and gradually the shaking subsided, the adrenaline faded, leaving only a bone-deep weariness. "I keep thinking about those rapids," Eloise said quietly, setting aside her empty bowl. "What would have happened if—" "Don't!" Graham moved to sit beside her on the bed, took her hand in his. "Don't think about it. We're both here, both safe. That's what matters." "Is it?" She turns to face him fully. "Graham, you said it yourself. You were thinking about the cattle, about not losing your breeding stock. You would have died for 200 cows. He flinched at her blunt words. "It sounds ridiculous when you put it that way." "It is ridiculous. This whole thing, building this massive ranch, isolating yourself to maintain it, sacrificing everything, including your own safety, to protect it. What's it all for if you're too dead to enjoy it?" "I don't know," he admitted. "I spent so long focused on building, on proving I could succeed despite the doubters, that I never stopped to ask myself why. What the end goal was beyond just more. More land, more cattle, more success." "And now?" Eloise asked softly. Graham was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing patterns on the back of her hand. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Now I want more than just success. I want a life worth living, Eloise. I want to come home to someone who cares whether I live or die. I want to build something that matters beyond just being impressive. I want to build a family, a real home, something that lasts because it's built on more than just stubborn determination." "Then do it," she said simply. "Stop letting this place consume you. Hire more help if you need it. Delegate responsibilities. Trust your men to handle things without risking yourself every time there's trouble. Live, Graham. Really live." He searched her face, and she saw the moment he truly heard her, truly understood what she was offering. "With you," he said. It wasn't quite a question, but close. "With me," Eloise confirmed. "If you want that. If you're ready to let someone in, to share not just your name and your house, but your life." "I've wanted that since the moment you agreed to marry me," Graham confessed. "Maybe even before. When I first heard about you from your father, something in the way he talked about you made me think maybe, just maybe, here was someone who could understand this life, who could be strong enough to handle the rough parts and kind enough to care about the gentler ones." "Your father said I was sensible," Eloise reminded him, but there was warmth in her voice now, not bitterness. "He undersold you." Graham's smile was soft in the lamplight. "You're brave and fierce and stubborn as hell. You rode into a flood to save me, then shouted sense into me in front of my men. You reorganized my entire bookkeeping system in 2 weeks and taught Colton to read when I'd been trying to convince him for months. You're not just sensible, Eloise, you're extraordinary." The words settled around her like a benediction, filling places she hadn't realized were empty. "I'm just me. Just a rancher's daughter who learned to work hard and make do with little." "You're my wife," Graham said firmly, "and that makes you the most important person in my world. It took nearly drowning for me to really understand that, but I do now. You matter more than the ranch, more than the cattle, more than any of it. You're what makes it all worth having." Eloise felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming rightness of this moment, this connection finally acknowledged and claimed. "I was so scared," she whispered. "When I saw you in that water, Graham, I was terrified, not of being alone or losing the security of this marriage, but of losing you, the person you are beneath all the reputation and armor. I couldn't bear it. You won't have to. He pulled her close, and she went willingly, tucking herself against his chest, where she could hear his heartbeat, steady and strong. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. We're partners now, Eloise. Really, truly partners. In all things. They lay down together as the last of the storm rumbled away toward the plains, exhaustion finally claiming them. Graham's arms stayed around her, solid and warm, and Eloise let herself relax completely for the first time since her wedding day. This was real now, not an arrangement or a transaction, but a true marriage, forged in floodwater and fear, and the desperate certainty that they'd finally found what they'd both been searching for. "Graham?" she murmured as sleep pulled at her. No more risking yourself unnecessarily. Promise me." His chest rumbled with quiet laughter. "I promise. Though you'll have to do the same. No more riding into floods. Only if you stop giving me reasons to." "Deal." He pressed a kiss to her hair, gentle and reverent. "Sleep now, Eloise. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." She drifted off in his arms, the sound of his breathing a comfort, his warmth chasing away the last of the chill from the storm. Outside, the rain had stopped completely, leaving the world washed clean and new. And inside the big house on Calder Ranch, two people who'd been strangers bound by necessity had finally become something more. Partners, lovers, husband and wife in more than just name. The storm had broken their walls and nearly broken them, but in the aftermath, they'd found something worth rebuilding everything for. Not an empire or a reputation or success measured in acreage and cattle, but something infinitely more valuable, a connection, a partnership, a love that neither had expected but both desperately needed. Graham had built his ranch to prove he could survive alone. Now, finally, he'd learned the greater truth, that survival wasn't the same as living, and living required someone to share it with. And Eloise, who'd married a monster and found a man instead, had discovered that the greatest courage wasn't in facing fear, but in choosing hope despite it, in reaching for connection even when isolation seemed safer. They'd saved each other in that flood, not just from drowning, but from the loneliness that had been slowly killing them both. And tomorrow, when they woke in each other's arms for the first time, they'd begin building something neither had dared dream possible when they'd spoken their vows in that tense ceremony weeks ago. A real marriage, a true partnership, a family born not from careful planning, but from the messy, terrifying, beautiful chaos of two lonely souls finally finding home in each other. Dawn came soft and golden through the windows, and for the first time in his adult life, Graham Calder woke with someone in his arms. Eloise was still sleeping, her dark hair spread across his chest, one hand resting over his heart as if checking to make sure it still beat. The sight made something fierce and protective surge through him. This woman who'd ridden into a flood to save him, who'd shouted sense into him when he'd been too stubborn to see it himself, who'd chosen to stay when she could have maintained the safe distance he'd offered. He shifted slightly, trying not to wake her, but her eyes fluttered open anyway. For a moment she looked confused, then memory clearly returned and her face softened into something that made his breath catch. "Morning," she murmured, voice rough with sleep. "Morning." He touched her face gently, still half afraid she might disappear if he wasn't careful. "How do you feel?" "Sore, exhausted, happy." She smiled at his surprised expression. "Is that strange? After nearly dying yesterday, I should probably be traumatized, but instead I just feel settled, like something finally clicked into place." Graham understood exactly what she meant. Despite the aches from yesterday's ordeal, despite the cut on his temple that throbbed with each heartbeat, he felt more at peace than he had in years. "Not strange at all. I feel it too." They lay there as the morning light strengthened, neither in a hurry to leave the cocoon of warmth and intimacy they'd created. Eventually, though, reality intruded in the form of Mrs. Brennan's knock on the door. "Breakfast in 30 minutes," the housekeeper called cheerfully. "And Mr. Calder, Colton says the north fence took some damage in the storm. Nothing urgent, but it'll need attention today." "Tell him I'll be down after breakfast," Graham called back, then caught the look on Eloise's face. "What?" You're delegating, she observed with obvious approval. Telling Colton to assess the damage instead of rushing out there yourself before you've even had coffee. Well, someone recently convinced me that I don't have to handle everything personally. He pulled her closer, pressed a kiss to her forehead. Someone who's apparently determined to keep me alive despite my best efforts to the contrary. Don't joke about that. But Eloise was smiling, her fingers tracing the bruises on his ribs. You scared 10 years off my life yesterday, Graham called her. I know. I'm sorry. He meant it, could still see her face when she'd pulled him from that creek, white with terror, fierce with determination. Won't happen again. It better not. I didn't go through all that trouble saving you just to have you do something stupid and get yourself killed anyway. They dressed together, a new intimacy in the simple act of helping each other with buttons and laces. Graham found himself watching the way morning light caught in Eloise's hair, the grace in how she moved despite yesterday's battering. When she caught him staring again, she just shook her head with fond exasperation. You really need to stop looking at me like that. Like what? Like you can't quite believe I'm real. I'm not sure I can, he admitted honestly. A month ago I was alone in this big house, resigned to building an empire with no one to share it. Now you're here, and everything's different. Better. I'm allowed to appreciate that, aren't I? Eloise crossed to him, straightened his collar with careful fingers. You're allowed. Just don't forget I'm flesh and blood, not some perfect vision. I have flaws, Graham, plenty of them. A temper for one thing, as you saw yesterday when I yelled at you in front of your men. You were right to yell. I needed to hear it. He caught her hands, held them gently. And I don't want perfect, Eloise. I just want real. Want someone who'll call me on my nonsense and save me from my own stubbornness. Apparently that's you. Apparently so. She reached up, kissed him softly. Come on. Mrs. Brennan's breakfast waits for no one, and we both need food after yesterday. Breakfast was a revelation in itself. Instead of sitting at opposite ends of the long dining table, they took their plates to the small table in the kitchen, sitting close enough to touch, talking through the day's plans like the partners they'd finally become. Mrs. Brennan bustled around them with barely concealed satisfaction, clearly pleased by this development. Mr. Merrick came by early this morning, she mentioned as she refilled their coffee. Heard about the storm, wanted to check if everyone was all right. Seemed genuine about it for once. Graham's expression grew wary. Did he now? Don't look so suspicious. The man's not all bad, just prideful and stubborn, like someone else I could mention, Mrs. Brennan gave Graham a pointed look. He left some preserves his wife put up, said to tell you he appreciated how you handled the creek situation, keeping things legal instead of taking matters into your own hands. He cut my fence and scattered my herd, Graham pointed out, which you handled through proper channels instead of riding over there with a rifle. That meant something to him, even if he was too proud to admit it at the time. The housekeeper set down the coffee pot. Maybe the storm reminded folks that we're all just trying to survive out here. Feuds seem pretty pointless when you're fighting nature instead of each other. Eloise watched Graham process this, saw him struggle between his instinct to maintain walls and the possibility of actual peace with a neighbor. She touched his arm gently. It wouldn't hurt to acknowledge the gesture, she said quietly. Not accepting it as friendship necessarily, but at least as a truce. Graham looked at her, then back at Mrs. Brennan. Tell Merrick thank you for checking on us, and tell him if he needs water access during dry spells he can ask. We'll work something out. The housekeeper's smile could have lit the whole kitchen. I'll do that. Now eat. You both look half-starved. After breakfast, Graham did go to check the fence damage, but this time Eloise went with him. They rode out together, taking their time, and she noticed how different he seemed. Less driven, more present, actually looking at the land he'd worked so hard to claim instead of just cataloging problems that needed fixing. It really is beautiful, she observed as they paused at a rise overlooking the valley. I can see why you fought so hard to keep it. It is beautiful. I just forgot to notice somewhere along the way. Graham guided his horse closer to hers, their legs nearly touching. Got so focused on defending and maintaining that I stopped seeing what I was defending. Stopped remembering why it mattered beyond just proving I could succeed. And now? Now I remember. It's not about proving anything to anyone else anymore. It's about building something worth having, something worth passing down. His hand found hers, squeezed gently. Something worth sharing with someone I care about. The fence repairs took most of the morning, but with the whole crew working together, and with Graham actually delegating tasks instead of trying to do everything himself, the work went smoothly. Eloise helped where she could, earning approving nods from the hands who were clearly pleased to see their boss's wife working alongside them. "You've got yourself a good one, boss," one of the older cowboys said to Graham during a water break. "Not many women would ride into a flood the way Mrs. Calder did yesterday." "I know exactly how lucky I am, Pete." Graham's eyes found Eloise across the work site, and the look on his face made several of the men smile knowingly. "About time you figured that out," Pete muttered, but he was grinning. "Ranch has been feeling mighty lonely with just you rattling around in that big house. Good to see it becoming a real home." Over the following weeks, the transformation continued. Graham moved his belongings into Eloise's room, their room now, and the master bedroom he'd occupied alone for so long became a guest room. They established routines, morning coffee together before the day began, evening walks around the property, quiet hours in the library where Graham would read while Eloise worked on the accounts or correspondence. The ranch itself seemed to settle into a new rhythm, with Graham delegating more and trusting his experienced hands to handle day-to-day operations. Problems got solved more efficiently, and he had time for things beyond just work. He taught Eloise the finer points of cattle ranching, showed her how to assess breeding stock and recognize potential problems in the herd. She, in turn, completely reorganized the business side of the operation, implementing systems that saved both time and money. "How did you manage before I got here?" she asked one evening, looking up from a ledger with bemused exasperation. "These accounts are a disaster, Graham. You were losing money in places you didn't even know existed." "I wasn't managing really, just surviving." He came to peer over her shoulder at the neat columns she'd created. "You've got a gift for this." "I've got a gift for organization. You've got a gift for everything else. The land, the cattle, reading weather patterns, knowing exactly what each pasture needs. We complement each other." "That we do." He pressed a kiss to her temple, gentle and familiar now. "I'm starting to think this arranged marriage was the best decision I ever made." Eloise tilted her head back to look at him. "Starting to think?" "All right, I'm certain. Completely, absolutely certain that marrying you was the smartest thing I've done in my entire stubborn, solitary life. Better?" "Much better." She pulled him down for a proper kiss, the ledgers momentarily forgotten. They were so absorbed in each other that neither heard Mrs. Brennan's knock until she cleared her throat loudly. "Sorry to interrupt, but there are visitors. Your parents, Mrs. Calder." Eloise jerked upright, suddenly nervous. She hadn't seen her parents since the wedding, and while she'd written letters assuring them she was well, words on paper couldn't convey the full transformation of her marriage. What would they think, seeing her so comfortable with Graham? Would her father feel guilty? Would her mother worry she was making the best of a bad situation? "Show them in," Graham said calmly, his hand settling on Eloise's shoulder in quiet support. "It's all right, Eloise. They'll see you're happy." But when her parents appeared in the doorway, it was her father who looked nervous, hat turning in his hands, eyes searching Eloise's face for signs of distress or unhappiness. Her mother looked equally anxious, clearly ready to stage a rescue if needed. "Mama, Papa." Eloise stood, went to them with a smile that was genuine and warm. "I'm so glad you came." "Eloise." Her mother hugged her fiercely, then pulled back to study her face. You look well, better than I expected." "I am well, Mama. Better than well, actually. I'm happy." Her father's eyes darted to Graham, who'd remained standing by the desk, giving them space but clearly ready to intervene if needed. "Mr. Calder has been treating you well, then?" "Graham," Eloise corrected gently. "And yes, Papa, he's been wonderful, kind and patient and everything I didn't expect but desperately needed." The relief on her father's face was almost painful to witness. "I'm glad. So glad, Eloise. I've been sick with worry, thinking I sold you into—" "You didn't sell me," Eloise interrupted firmly. "You gave me an opportunity, and I chose to take it. Yes, the circumstances weren't ideal, but what's grown from them?" She glanced back at Graham, who was watching her with such open affection that even her parents couldn't miss it. What's grown from them is real and good. We've built something together, Papa. A real marriage, a real partnership. Her mother was crying now, relief mixing with joy. Oh, sweetheart, when we left you here, so frightened, I thought my heart would break. But seeing you now— I know I was terrified on our wedding day, Eloise admitted. I'd heard such terrible things about Graham's reputation. But Mama, people were wrong. Or rather, they only saw part of the truth and assumed the worst. He's been alone so long, working so hard to prove himself, that people mistook his determination for ruthlessness. The important thing, Graham said quietly, finally stepping forward, is that Eloise is happy, that she feels safe and valued here. That's all that matters. Her father studied Graham for a long moment, then slowly extended his hand. Thank you, Mr. Calder, for keeping your word, for treating my daughter with the respect and kindness you promised. Graham shook his hand firmly. Graham, please. We're family now, and I should be thanking you for raising a daughter strong enough and brave enough to give me a chance despite everything she'd heard. I don't deserve her, but I'm grateful every day that she's here. The visit stretched through lunch and into the afternoon, tension gradually easing as Eloise's parents saw for themselves the truth of her happiness. Her father and Graham talked about ranching, finding common ground in shared experiences and challenges. Her mother helped Eloise and Mrs. Brennan prepare dinner, occasionally stopping to hug her daughter, as if reassuring herself it was all real. I can't believe the change in you, her mother said quietly as they worked together in the kitchen. When you left, you looked like you were going to your execution. Now you're practically glowing. Eloise felt her cheeks warm. Things have changed between Graham and me. Mama, he's nothing like what people say. He's lonely and has been hurt by isolation, but underneath he's gentle and thoughtful and works harder than anyone I've ever met. And he looks at me like I'm the most important thing in his world. I can see that. The way he watches you when you're not looking, like he can't quite believe his good fortune. Her mother touched her cheek gently. I'm so relieved, Eloise. I've barely slept since the wedding, worrying I'd failed you by not fighting harder against the arrangement. You didn't fail me. If anything, this has been the making of me. I've learned what I'm capable of. Saved Graham's life in a flood, helped reorganize an entire ranch operation, stood up to him when he was being stubborn. I'm stronger here than I ever was at home. I can see that too. Her mother smiled through fresh tears. My little girl has become quite the formidable woman. When her parents finally left as evening approached, her father pulled Eloise aside. I know I said this already, but I need to say it again. I'm sorry for putting you in this position. Even if it worked out well, even if you're happy now, I should have found another way. Papa, stop. Eloise took his weathered hands in hers. You did what you had to do to save our family's legacy. And yes, it was terrifying at first, but it brought me to exactly where I needed to be. With someone who values me, who sees me as a partner, who's building a life I'm proud to be part of. That's worth more than a traditional courtship and a love match that might have been based more on illusion than reality. Her father nodded, eyes suspiciously bright. Your mother and I are heading to California next month. Her sister's husband has offered me a position managing their ranch. With the money from Mr. Calder, Graham, we'll be comfortable, maybe even prosperous. So at least that burden's off your shoulders. I'm glad, Papa. You both deserve a fresh start, a chance to rebuild without the weight of debt and drought. She hugged him tightly. Write to me when you're settled, and visit whenever you can. This is your home too now. After they left, Eloise stood on the porch watching the dust from their wagon settle, feeling Graham's presence behind her before his arms came around her waist. That went well, he observed. They were so worried, all this time thinking they'd condemn me to misery. She leaned back against his chest, solid and warm. It was good for them to see the truth. And what is the truth exactly? Graham asked, his breath warm against her ear. That I'm happy, that I'm exactly where I'm meant to be. She turned in his arms to face him. That I'm falling in love with my husband, even though this started as nothing but a practical arrangement. Graham went very still, his eyes searching hers. Falling in love? Is that so surprising? You're kind and hardworking and protective. You read poetry and save baby calves and look at me like I hung the moon. What's not to love? His arms tightened around her, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. I've been in love with you for weeks, Eloise. Since that night you yelled at me after the flood, maybe even before. But I didn't want to pressure you, didn't want you to feel obligated to return feelings just because we're married. Nothing about how I feel is obligation. She reached up to touch his face, felt the slight roughness of his evening stubble. I choose this, Graham. Choose you. Not because I have to, but because I want to. Because you've shown me what partnership really means, what it feels like to be valued for more than just being sensible or practical. He kissed her then, deep and thorough, pouring everything he felt into the connection between them. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and the look in his eyes made her stomach flutter. I don't deserve you, he murmured against her lips. Yes, you do. You deserve someone who sees past the reputation to the man beneath. Someone who'll stand beside you through storms and challenges. Someone who'll call you on your nonsense and save you from your own stubbornness. She smiled. And you're stuck with me now, so you'd better get used to being loved. I think I can manage that. His smile was bright enough to rival the setting sun. Come inside, wife. Let me show you exactly how much I love you back. The months that followed were the happiest Graham had ever known. The ranch prospered under their combined management, his knowledge of the land and Eloise's organizational skills creating an efficiency that impressed even the most experienced hands. Word spread that Calder Ranch was well-run and fair, and when Graham put out a call for additional workers, he had his pick of skilled cowboys looking for steady employment. More importantly, the isolation that had defined his life began to crack. With Eloise by his side, other ranchers became less hostile, more willing to work together on shared concerns. The Merrick family invited them to dinner, an evening that started awkward but ended with genuine friendliness. The town, seeing Eloise's obvious happiness and Graham's softer demeanor, gradually revised their assessment of the feared cattle baron. You've changed everything, Graham told Eloise one evening as they walked through the pastures in the golden light before sunset. The ranch, the town, my entire life. I don't know how to thank you for that. You don't need to thank me. We changed things together. She squeezed his hand. Besides, I think I've gained just as much from this marriage as you have. A home, purpose, a partnership that values what I bring. And love, Graham. More love than I ever dreamed of having. They paused at the rise where they'd stopped that first time she'd ridden out to check the fences, looking out over the valley that stretched to the mountains. The land was lush now, recovered from drought, cattle dotting the landscape in peaceful abundance. There's something I need to tell you, Eloise said quietly, her free hand moving unconsciously to her stomach. Graham noticed the gesture, and something flickered in his face. Hope, fear, wonder, all mixed together. Eloise? I'm with child, Graham. The doctor in town confirmed it yesterday when I went for supplies. She watched his face carefully, suddenly uncertain. They'd talked about children in abstract terms, but the reality was different. I know we've only been truly married a few months, and if it's too soon... She didn't get to finish. Graham pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, and she felt him shaking against her. Graham? Are you all right? He pulled back and she saw tears on his face, actual tears from the man who never showed emotion in public. I'm more than all right. Eloise, you've just given me something I never thought I'd have. A family. A real family. His reaction was so overwhelming, so genuinely joyful, that Eloise felt her own tears start. You're happy about this? Happy doesn't begin to cover it. He laughed, the sound bright and free. You're carrying our child. We're going to be parents. How could I be anything but deliriously happy? He spun her around, careful despite his excitement, then set her down and immediately looked worried. Should you be riding? Walking this far? What did the doctor say about... Graham? She stopped his anxious questions with a kiss. I'm pregnant, not made of glass. Dr. Morrison said I'm healthy and strong, that I should continue normal activities until I'm uncomfortable. So stop looking at me like I might break. I can't help it. You're carrying the most precious thing in the world. His hand settled gently on her still flat stomach, reverence in the gesture. Our child, Eloise. Can you believe it? I'm beginning to. She covered his hand with hers. I was terrified to tell you, wasn't sure how you'd react. But seeing you like this, so happy and already so protective. Did you really think I'd be anything but thrilled? Graham asked, genuinely puzzled. I didn't know. Some men see children as burdens, especially early in a marriage, and we have so much else to manage with the ranch. The ranch means nothing compared to this, to you and our baby. He said it with such conviction that Eloise's last worries dissolved. This is what I was building toward all along, even when I didn't realize it. Not just land and success, but something worth passing down. Someone to inherit not just property, but a home. A legacy of more than just stubborn survival. They walked back to the house as darkness fell, Graham's arm around Eloise's shoulders, both of them lost in the wonder of this new development. Mrs. Brennan took one look at their faces and burst into delighted tears, immediately beginning to plan nurseries and baby clothes and everything else a new infant would need. This house is finally going to have the family it was built for, the housekeeper declared, wiping her eyes. Oh, Mr. Calder, I'm so happy for you both. Graham, he corrected absently, too focused on Eloise to care much about anything else. And thank you, Mrs. Brennan. We're going to need your help. Neither of us knows the first thing about babies. Well, lucky for you, I raised 3 of my own. We'll figure it out together. That night, lying in their bed with Graham's hand resting protectively on her stomach, Eloise thought about how far they'd come. From strangers bound by desperation and debt to true partners, from fear and isolation to love and hope. And now they were creating new life. A child who would grow up knowing both parents loved them, who would inherit a ranch run with fairness and care, who would never doubt they were wanted and cherished. What are you thinking? Graham asked softly, clearly not asleep despite the late hour. That I was wrong about you, Eloise admitted. That day I married you, I was terrified, certain I'd bound myself to a monster. But you were never a monster, Graham, just a lonely man who'd forgotten what it meant to let someone in. And you reminded me. He pressed a kiss to her shoulder. You forced your way past every defense, every wall, until I couldn't pretend anymore that I didn't need this. Need you. Need us. Do you regret it? The way we started? No. His answer was immediate and firm. I regret that you were frightened. Regret that circumstances forced the choice instead of letting it happen naturally. But regret marrying you? Never. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me, Eloise Calder. You and this baby we're going to have. She turned in his arms, found his lips in the darkness. I love you, Graham. I know I've said it before, but I need you to hear it again. I love you, not because you saved my family or provided security, but because of who you are. The man behind the quiet eyes, the person everyone else was too scared or too blind to see. I love you too. He said it like a vow, like a promise. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret taking a chance on me. As sleep finally claimed them both, wrapped around each other in the big bed that had once seemed too large for one lonely man, the house settled into peaceful silence. Outside, the ranch sprawled beneath a star-filled sky, the land quiet and content. And inside, 2 people who'd married as strangers had found what they'd both been searching for. Not just love, but home. Not just partnership, but family. Not just survival, but a life worth living. The arranged marriage that had begun in fear and desperation had transformed into something neither could have imagined. A love story written in storm, in courage, in patience and revelation, in the daily choice to see past reputation to the truth beneath. And soon, very soon, that love would take physical form in a child who would grow up knowing exactly what their parents had learned the hard way. That family isn't just blood, home isn't just a place, and love isn't always found where you expect it. Sometimes it's found in quiet eyes, in careful touches, in the space between fear and trust, where 2 lonely souls finally find their way to each other. Winter came early that year, wrapping the ranch in snow that transformed the familiar landscape into something magical and new. Eloise's pregnancy progressed through the cold months, her body changing in ways that still amazed Graham every time he looked at her. He'd become almost comically protective, hovering whenever she moved too quickly, insisting she rest more than she thought necessary, driving Mrs. Brennan to distraction with his constant worry. "Graham, I'm pregnant, not dying," Eloise said for what felt like the 100th time, catching him watching her with that anxious expression as she descended the stairs one morning. "Women have been doing this since the beginning of time." "I know that. Intellectually, I know that." He moved to her side anyway, offering his arm. "But you're not just any woman. You're my wife, carrying my child, and if something happened to you, nothing's going to happen to me." She took his arm more to reassure him than because she needed support. "Dr. Morrison says I'm healthy as a horse. Strong constitution, good hips, excellent prospects for an easy delivery. So please, stop treating me like I'm made of porcelain." But he couldn't seem to help himself. The man who'd once risked his life riding into storms now fretted over his wife walking downstairs or lifting anything heavier than a teacup. Eloise found it equal parts endearing and exasperating, though she had to admit there was something sweet about his fierce protectiveness. The hands found it hilarious. "Boss won't let Mrs. Calder lift a finger," Colton reported to the others one evening in the bunkhouse, grinning. "Saw him practically carry her across a puddle yesterday. A puddle that was maybe an inch deep." "Man's in love," Pete said philosophically. "Makes even the toughest men go soft. Not that I'm complaining. He's a lot easier to work for now that he's happy. Used to be all business all the time. Now he actually smiles." It was true. The change in Graham was visible to everyone who knew him. The hard edges had softened, the constant tension eased. He still worked as hard as ever, but there was joy in it now instead of just grim determination. He laughed more, talked more, engaged with his men in ways he never had before. And everyone knew Eloise was the reason for the transformation. "You've made him human again," Mrs. Brennan told Eloise one afternoon as they sat together sewing baby clothes. "Or maybe human for the first time. I don't think he ever let himself be soft before you came along." "He was never as hard as people thought," Eloise said, carefully stitching a tiny gown. "He just protected himself the only way he knew how, by keeping everyone at a distance." "And you refused to stay at a distance." The housekeeper's smile was warm. "Best thing that ever happened to this place, you coming here." Best thing that ever happened to Graham. As Eloise's body grew rounder with their child, something else grew with it. A sense of belonging, of rightness, of home that neither she nor Graham had fully experienced before. The ranch wasn't just a business anymore, but a true homestead. The big house no longer echoing with loneliness, but filled with life and warmth and the anticipation of new beginnings. Her parents visited twice more before the baby came, bringing news from California and evident relief at seeing their daughter so obviously thriving. Other visitors came too, neighboring ranchers who'd softened their stance toward Graham, women from town who wanted to befriend the wife who'd somehow tamed the fearsome Graham Calder, even the minister who'd performed their hasty wedding ceremony, curious to see how the unlikely marriage had turned out. "I'll confess, I had my doubts," Reverend Stone admitted during one visit, accepting coffee from Mrs. Brennan. "It seemed like a transaction more than a marriage, and I worried for Mrs. Calder. But seeing you both together now, well, the Lord works in mysterious ways." "That he does," Graham agreed, his hand finding Eloise's across the table. "I thought I was making a practical arrangement. Turns out I was finding exactly what I needed, even if I didn't know I needed it." "And you, Mrs. Calder?" the Reverend asked. "Are you content with how things turned out?" Eloise didn't hesitate. "More than content. I was terrified on our wedding day, certain I was marrying a monster. Instead, I found a good man who'd been alone too long, who needed someone to see past his reputation to who he really was. I found home, Reverend Stone. Not just a house or a ranch, but genuine home in every sense that matters." The minister left satisfied that he hadn't married a young woman into misery, and his positive reports in town further improved Graham's standing. It seemed the whole community was revising their assessment of the man they'd feared, recognizing that perhaps they'd been wrong about Graham Calder all along. "Does it bother you?" Eloise asked Graham one evening as they sat together in the library, her feet propped on a stool while he read beside her. "That people are only now deciding you're not a monster, after years of treating you like one?" Graham considered the question, setting aside his book. "It used to make me bitter, thinking about all the judgments, the assumptions, the way people crossed the street to avoid me. But now, He shrugged. Now I don't care as much. Let them think what they want. I know the truth, you know the truth. And that's enough. When did you stop caring? When I finally had something more important to care about. His eyes were soft on her face. You changed my priorities, Eloise. Made me realize I'd been so focused on what other people thought, trying to prove them wrong or just survive their hostility, that I'd forgotten what actually mattered. Building a life worth living, creating something beyond just success, having someone to share it all with. She reached for his hand, laced their fingers together. I'm glad I could do that for you. Though technically, you did it for yourself. I just helped you remember what you were working toward. You did more than help me remember. You gave me a reason. He moved to sit beside her on the sofa, careful of her swollen belly. Before you, this ranch was everything because I had nothing else. Now it's just one part of a much bigger picture, a home, a family, a future that extends beyond just me and my stubborn determination. The baby kicked then, strong enough that Graham felt it against his hand where it rested on Eloise's stomach. Wonder crossed his face, the same expression he wore every time he felt their child move. Never gets old, he murmured, feeling life we created together, knowing in a few months we'll meet this little person. A few months? Eloise laughed. Try a few weeks if Dr. Morrison is right about my timing. This baby's coming soon, Graham. Are you ready? No. His honesty was endearing. Terrified, actually. What if I'm a terrible father? What if I don't know what to do? What if... Graham. She stopped his spiral with a gentle touch. You're going to be a wonderful father. Patient, protective, devoted. This child is lucky to have you. And you, he said firmly. Lucky to have both of us. A mother who's brave and smart and refuses to let anyone tell her she can't do something. We're going to raise quite the formidable child. I certainly hope so. Eloise smiled, imagining their son or daughter growing up in this house, running through these rooms, learning to ride in these pastures. Someone has to inherit all this and run it properly someday. Speaking of which, Graham said carefully, I've been thinking about the ranch, about making some changes to how it's structured. What kind of changes? Legal ones. I want to make you a full partner, Eloise, not just my wife, but joint owner of everything. The land, the cattle, the business, all of it. What's mine should be equally yours. She stared at him, surprised. Graham, you don't have to do that. I'm not asking for... I know you're not asking. That's part of why I want to do it. He took both her hands, his expression serious. Eloise, you've transformed this place. You've made it more efficient, more profitable, more livable. You've turned a cold business into a real home. You deserve to be recognized as the partner you are, legally and officially. And if something happened to me, I want to know you and our child are protected, that no one can challenge your right to this place. Nothing's going to happen to you, she said, but her throat was tight with emotion. But Graham, that's incredibly generous. It's not generous, it's right. It's fair. And it's what I should have done the moment we became true partners instead of just two people sharing a name. He squeezed her hands gently. Say yes, Eloise, let me make this official. Yes, she whispered. Yes, of course, thank you. Don't thank me. You've earned every acre, every head of cattle, every inch of this place with your work and dedication. I'm just making the paperwork match reality. They handled the legal arrangements the following week, with a lawyer from Denver coming out to draw up the documents that made Eloise Calder a full co-owner of the ranch. The news rippled through the community, another sign that Graham Calder was different from his reputation suggested. What ruthless cattle baron would voluntarily share power with his wife? He must really love her, people whispered in town. Making her a full partner like that, most men wouldn't dream of giving up that kind of control. Shows he trusts her, others pointed out, and from what I hear, she's as much responsible for that ranch's success as he is. Maybe more. She's the one who organized everything properly. The talk was kinder now, tinged with respect rather than fear, and while Graham claimed not to care what people thought anymore, Eloise noticed he stood a little taller when they went to town, smiled a bit more freely when neighbors greeted them warmly instead of nervously. February brought bitter cold and deep snow, and also the first real scare of Eloise's pregnancy. She woke one night to cramping pains that made her gasp, fear flooding through her that something was wrong with the baby. Graham woke instantly at her distress. "Eloise, what is it?" "Pain," she managed. "Graham, something's wrong. It's too early. The baby's not due yet." He was up and moving before she finished, throwing on clothes and shouting for Mrs. Brennan. Within minutes, the housekeeper was there with her practical competence, examining Eloise with experienced hands while Graham paced anxiously. "It's not labor," Mrs. Brennan announced after a tense few minutes. "Just false contractions, common enough in the last weeks, but we should send for Dr. Morrison, just to be safe." "I'll go," Graham said immediately. "You'll do no such thing," the housekeeper countered firmly. "It's the middle of the night, there's a foot of snow on the ground, and your wife needs you here. Send Colton. He's young and hardy, and his horse knows the trail to town even in the dark." Graham looked torn between his need to do something and his reluctance to leave Eloise's side. She made the decision for him, catching his hand. "Stay with me. Please. I need you here." He stayed, holding her hand while Colton rode through the winter night to fetch the doctor, talking to her in low, soothing tones that helped ease her fear. By the time Dr. Morrison arrived an hour later, the pains had subsided and Eloise was exhausted but no longer frightened. The doctor examined her thoroughly, then smiled reassuringly. "False alarm, as Mrs. Brennan suspected. Your body's preparing for the real thing, which could happen any day now. But there's nothing to worry about. You and the baby are both fine." "You're certain?" Graham asked, his hand still gripping Eloise's. "Positive. Mrs. Calder is healthy, the baby is positioned well, and based on what I'm seeing, I'd say you'll be parents within the week." Dr. Morrison packed his bag, clearly amused by Graham's evident anxiety. "Though I suggest you find a way to relax, Mr. Calder. You'll be no use to your wife during delivery if you're wound so tight you snap." After the doctor left, Graham refused to return to bed, instead sitting beside Eloise and watching her like he expected her to disappear if he looked away. "You need to sleep," she told him gently. "If the baby really is coming soon, we both need rest." "I can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "What if something goes wrong? Women die in childbirth, Eloise. All the time, strong, healthy women, and most women survive just fine," she interrupted firmly. "Graham, I'm not going to die. I'm strong, healthy, and Dr. Morrison says everything looks good. You need to trust that." "I can't lose you," his voice cracked. "I can't. Not now. Not after finally finding you, finding this life, finding what happiness actually feels like. If something happened to you because of my child, our child," Eloise corrected. "And nothing is going to happen to me. I'm going to be fine, the baby is going to be fine, and you're going to be a wonderful father, but right now you need to breathe and trust and let me rest." He did eventually lie down beside her, though she suspected he didn't sleep much. His arms stayed around her protectively, and she felt him tense every time she shifted position. It was exhausting having him so worried, but it was also deeply touching. This fierce, fearsome man reduced to terrified vulnerability at the thought of losing her. 3 days later, in the early hours of a Sunday morning, Eloise woke to different pains, stronger, regular, unmistakable. She touched Graham's shoulder gently. "It's time." He was awake instantly, eyes wide with panic and excitement. "Time? Real time? Are you sure?" "Very sure." She breathed through a contraction, using the techniques Mrs. Brennan had taught her. "We need to get Dr. Morrison back here. And Graham, try to stay calm." Staying calm proved impossible for Graham. He sent Colton racing to town for the doctor, then paced the house like a caged animal while Mrs. Brennan and 2 other ranch wives who'd come to help got Eloise settled and comfortable. They tried to send him away, told him this was women's work, but he refused to leave. "She's my wife," he said flatly. "I'm staying." Mrs. Brennan looked at Eloise, who nodded. "Let him stay. I want him here." So Graham stayed through the long hours of labor, holding Eloise's hand, wiping her forehead, murmuring encouragement even as his own fear threatened to overwhelm him. It was brutal, watching her in pain and being helpless to stop it. Every cry she couldn't quite suppress felt like a knife to his heart. "I'm sorry," he kept saying. I'm so sorry for putting you through this. Stop apologizing, Eloise gasped between contractions. This is normal. Women do this all the time. I'm fine. But she didn't look fine. She looked exhausted and in pain, and Graham felt like the world's worst monster for being the cause of her suffering, even indirectly. Dr. Morrison arrived and took charge with calm efficiency, examining Eloise and pronouncing everything normal and progressing well. Could be a few more hours yet, he warned. First babies take their time. Those hours were the longest of Graham's life. He'd faced down rustlers and wolves, survived storms and droughts, built an empire through sheer determination, but nothing had prepared him for watching Eloise struggle through childbirth. He felt useless, helpless, terrified that despite all the reassurances, something would go wrong. Then, just as the sun was setting and bathing the room in golden light, everything changed. The urgency increased, Mrs. Brennan and the other women moving with practiced efficiency, while Dr. Morrison gave quiet instructions. "All right, Mrs. Calder," the doctor said. "Time to push. Your baby's ready to meet the world." What followed was intense and primal and beautiful in a way Graham couldn't have imagined. Eloise, exhausted but determined, found reserves of strength he'd known were there but never witnessed so clearly. She pushed when told to push, rested when allowed, and never once complained or gave up despite the obvious agony. And then, suddenly, a baby's cry split the air, loud, indignant, unmistakably alive. "It's a boy," Dr. Morrison announced, grinning as he lifted the squalling infant. "Healthy lungs on this one. Congratulations, both of you." A son. They had a son. Graham stared at the tiny, red-faced infant being cleaned and wrapped, unable to process that this little person was his, was theirs, was the culmination of everything they'd built together. "Graham?" Eloise's voice was weak but happy. "Do you want to hold him?" Mrs. Brennan placed the baby in his arms, and Graham looked down at his son for the first time. The infant had stopped crying, was looking up at him with unfocused eyes, and Graham felt something crack open in his chest, a love so fierce and immediate it nearly brought him to his knees. "He's perfect," he whispered. "Eloise, he's absolutely perfect." "He is," she agreed, smiling despite her exhaustion. "Bring him here. I want to see him properly." Graham carefully sat on the edge of the bed, placing their son in Eloise's arms. She looked down at the baby with such tenderness that Graham felt tears sting his eyes. Happy tears, grateful tears, tears of relief that she was all right and their child was healthy and this impossible, beautiful thing had actually happened. "What should we name him?" Eloise asked softly, tracing their son's tiny face with a gentle finger. They'd discussed names but never settled on one, both wanting to see the baby first before deciding. Graham looked at his son, this small miracle who represented everything good in his life and suddenly knew. "Thomas," he said. "After my father. Thomas John, if you'd like. John for your father." Eloise's eyes brightened. "Thomas John Calder. That's perfect, Graham. That's absolutely perfect." The next few days passed in a blur of exhaustion and wonder. Thomas was a good baby, healthy and strong, sleeping and eating on a reasonable schedule that let his parents recover from the intensity of his birth. Graham was utterly besotted, hovering over the cradle Mrs. Brennan had set up in their room, watching his son sleep with an expression of such naked love that Eloise's heart squeezed every time she saw it. "You're staring at him again," she observed one evening, catching Graham bent over the cradle for the third time in an hour. "I can't help it. I still can't believe he's real, that we made this little person." Graham straightened, came to sit beside her on the bed. "Eloise, I don't have words for what you've given me. A family. A real, actual family. I never thought I'd have this." "We gave it to each other," she corrected gently. "You gave me a home and partnership and love. I gave you softness and trust, and now a son. We built this together, Graham." "That we did." He kissed her softly, carefully mindful of how recently she'd given birth. "And I'm going to spend every day making sure you and Thomas know how grateful I am, how much I love you both." Word of Thomas's birth spread quickly, and visitors came in a steady stream, neighbors bringing gifts and congratulations, ranch hands wanting to see the boss's new son, even some of the townspeople who'd once feared Graham now stopping by to welcome the new baby. The house was filled with activity and warmth, more alive than it had ever been. Eloise's parents arrived 2 weeks after the birth, her mother immediately taking over with the practical competence of someone who'd raised children herself. Her father held his grandson with trembling hands, tears running down his weathered face. "Thank you," he whispered to Eloise, "for giving us this, for not hating me for what I did, for making something beautiful from that impossible situation." "Papa, stop!" Eloise hugged him carefully, still tender from childbirth. "You gave me the best gift imaginable, even if neither of us knew it at the time. You gave me Graham, and this life, and now Thomas. I could never hate you for that." Winter slowly gave way to spring, snow melting to reveal the land preparing for new growth. Thomas grew stronger, more alert, beginning to smile and respond to his parents' voices. Graham was a devoted father, changing diapers without complaint, walking the floor on nights when Thomas couldn't settle, singing off-key lullabies that somehow worked better than Eloise's more melodious efforts. "You're a natural, Mrs. N," Brennan observed one afternoon, watching Graham feed his son with the careful concentration he brought to everything he cared about. "Never thought I'd see Graham Calder reduced to baby talk, but here we are." "Here we are indeed," Graham agreed, not taking his eyes off Thomas. "And I wouldn't trade it for anything, not for more land or cattle or success. This right here, this is what matters." One warm spring evening, when Thomas was nearly 4 months old, Graham and Eloise sat on the porch together watching the sunset. Their son slept peacefully in Eloise's arms, and the ranch spread out before them in peaceful abundance. "Do you ever think about that day?" Eloise asked quietly. "Our wedding day, I mean. How different everything was." "All the time." Graham's arm came around her shoulders. "I think about the terrified young woman in an ill-fitting dress, marrying a man she'd been told to fear. I think about how desperate I was for connection, how lonely I'd been without even realizing it. And I think about how impossible it seemed that anything good could come from such a beginning. But good things did come from it. The best things." He looked at her, at their sleeping son, at the home they'd created together. "Everything that matters, Eloise. You gave me everything that matters." "We gave it to each other," she reminded him again. "I was just as lost as you were, just in different ways. You gave me purpose and partnership and a place where I could be more than just sensible. You saw me, Graham. Really saw me when most people only saw what was practical or useful." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the light fade from gold to purple to deep blue. The ranch was quiet, peaceful, settled into evening routines. In the distance, they could hear the hands finishing up, horses being put away, the sounds of a well-run operation winding down for the day. "Do you have any regrets?" Graham asked suddenly. "About how we started? About being forced into this marriage?" Eloise considered the question seriously. Did she regret the fear and uncertainty? The way her father had been backed into a corner, her family's desperation, the terror she'd felt on her wedding day? "No," she said finally, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Because if things had been different, if my father had found another way to save the ranch, I never would have met you, never would have discovered what we could build together, never would have had Thomas, or this life, or this home. So no, Graham. No regrets. Just gratitude that desperation and debt led me exactly where I needed to be. Even though you were terrified? Even though. Sometimes the best things come from the scariest beginnings. Sometimes you have to walk through fear to find what's waiting on the other side." Graham pulled her closer, mindful of the baby between them. "I love you," Eloise called her, "more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. You took a broken, lonely man and taught him how to live again, how to hope, how to trust, how to let someone in. You're my miracle. And you're mine." She leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling Thomas's warm weight in her arms, Graham's solid presence beside her. "The man I feared became the man I can't imagine living without. The quiet eyes that terrified me became the ones I look for in every room. The monster of reputation became the gentlest person I know." "I was never a monster," Graham said softly, "just scared and alone and too stubborn to admit it. I know that now. Wish I'd known it then. would have saved us both some anguish. But we found our way regardless. He pressed a kiss to her hair. That's what matters. Not how we started, but where we ended up. Together. Happy. Building something worth having. Thomas stirred in Eloise's arms, making the little sounds that meant he'd wake soon and demand feeding. She smiled down at him, at this tiny person who was the living proof of everything she and Graham had created. He has your eyes, she observed. Even this young, I can see it, those same winter storm eyes that I was so afraid of once. And your stubbornness, I suspect. Kids got strong opinions for being 4 months old. They laughed together, and the sound carried across the peaceful evening. Inside, Mrs. Brennan was preparing supper. In the bunkhouse, the hands were settling in for the night. And here on the porch, the Calder family sat together, husband and wife and child, the partnership that had seemed so impossible, now the most natural thing in the world. Years later, when Thomas was joined by a daughter named Margaret, after Eloise's mother, and then another son they called William, people would talk about the Calder Ranch as an example of what could be built with hard work and dedication. They'd mention Graham Calder's transformation from feared loner to respected family man, his wife's equal partnership in the ranch's success, the way the couple had changed not just their own lives, but the whole community's approach to cooperation and fairness. But they'd never know the full story. The terror of that first wedding day, the careful dance of two strangers learning to trust, the flood that nearly killed them both but instead brought them together, the moment Eloise chose love over fear and Graham chose partnership over isolation. Some stories were meant to stay private, known only to those who lived them. The fear and uncertainty, the gradual revelation, the choice to keep trying when giving up would have been easier. Those belonged to Graham and Eloise alone. What the world saw was the result. A thriving ranch, a happy family, a love that had started as transaction and transformed into something real and lasting. They saw the man whose reputation had softened, the woman who'd tamed him, the children who would inherit not just land, but a legacy of partnership and perseverance. They didn't see the quiet moments, Graham watching Eloise sleep, still amazed she'd chosen to stay. Eloise catching sight of her husband across a crowded room and feeling her heart skip the same way it had when he'd first smiled at her, really smiled, in the library all those months ago. The private jokes and shared glances, the teamwork that made the ranch run smoothly, the 1,000 small kindnesses that built a life together. Those moments were theirs alone. "Do you think Thomas will remember any of this?" Eloise asked as their son finally woke and began to fuss. "Being this young, I mean. Living here while it's just the three of us?" "Probably not," Graham admitted. "But he'll grow up knowing he's loved, that he has parents who chose each other and built something worth having. That home isn't just a place, but a feeling. And family isn't just blood, but the people who see you fully and love you anyway. That's a good legacy to leave him. It's the best legacy, better than land or wealth or reputation. We'll teach him to be kind but firm, generous but wise, strong but gentle. All the things I had to learn the hard way, he'll know from the start because he has you as a mother and me trying my damnedest not to mess him up." Eloise laughed, stood carefully with Thomas in her arms. "You're not going to mess him up. You're going to be a wonderful father, teaching him everything about this land and how to care for it properly. And when he's older, we'll tell him the story. Maybe not all of it, but enough. How his parents met through an unusual arrangement, how they learned to love each other, how sometimes the best things come from unexpected beginnings. Will we tell him his mother saved his father's life in a flood? Probably. Build character, knowing his parents aren't perfect but human, that they made mistakes and learned from them, that love isn't always easy, but it's always worth fighting for." Graham followed her inside, his hand finding the small of her back in that unconscious gesture of connection they'd developed. The house welcomed them, warm and bright, smelling of Mrs. Brennan's cooking, filled with the accumulated touches that made it home rather than just an impressive structure. This was what they'd built together. Not just a successful ranch or a family or a reputation transformed from feared to respected, but a life, messy and beautiful, challenging and rewarding, built one choice at a time from the shaky foundation of an arranged marriage into something neither could have imagined on that terrifying wedding day. Eloise had been forced to wed the cowboy she feared, and in doing so, she'd found kindness behind his quiet eyes, found love where she'd expected cruelty, partnership where she'd anticipated domination, home where she'd thought she'd find only obligation. And Graham, who'd offered marriage as a practical solution to mutual needs, had found something infinitely more valuable. Someone who saw past his reputation to the lonely man beneath, who chose to stay not because she had to, but because she wanted to, who taught him that success meant nothing without someone to share it with. They'd saved each other in that flood, but the saving had started long before, in quiet conversations and careful revelations, in the daily choice to see the best in each other, in the gradual understanding that sometimes strangers make the best partners because they have no assumptions to overcome, just truth to discover. As night settled over the ranch and the Calder family gathered for supper, Graham and Eloise and Thomas, with Mrs. Brennan fussing over them all, the house felt exactly as it should. Not perfect, perhaps, but real. Not always easy, but always worth it. And somewhere in the quiet spaces between words, in the glances exchanged over the baby's head, in the comfortable silence that only came from truly knowing another person, lay the truth that neither needed to speak aloud. They'd found what they'd both been searching for, even when they hadn't known they were searching. Found home in each other, found love in the space between fear and trust, found that sometimes the best stories start with the words, "I was forced," and end with, "and I'm grateful every day that I was." The monster was never real. The fear was justified but unnecessary. The quiet eyes held kindness all along, waiting for someone brave enough to look closely enough to see it. And the wife who'd arrived shaking with terror on her wedding day now sat at her husband's table with their son in her arms and peace in her heart, knowing that she was exactly, precisely, perfectly where she was always meant to be.